In this video, I'm going to show you how to create a Calendly clone using Next.js, where you create various different events that people can schedule with you. And as long as it fits within the schedules that you have defined and fits within the events in your Google Calendar, it'll let them book. So for example, you can go to an event, you can copy the link for that event and send it to them, and it'll bring them to a page like this where they can choose where they want to schedule a call. For example, let's say they want to do a quick 30-minute call. They can click select here, and then they can choose a date and time that works for them. For example, on Wednesday the 4th, they have the ability to click any time between 3 o'clock and 4:30. So let's go ahead and choose 3:45. All they need to do then is enter their name and their email address, and then any additional notes. We'll just say this is some info. This notes field is optional if they don't want to put it. And then underneath my camera, they can click on the schedule button. So once they click schedule, it'll go ahead and schedule that. You can see they've been successfully booked on September 4th. It'll even send them an email so that they can confirm this inside of the Google Calendar. And now if we go to Google Calendar, you can see there's a brand new event in our calendar for Rick and Kyle to meet for a quick call that lasts exactly 30 minutes at 3:45. You'll also see all of the additional notes that they made are left inside of here, so all the information you need you can find right on your Google Calendar. And the best part is, now that we have an event at 3:45, if we tried to schedule another event at that time, for example, I'm going to copy over this quick call and go to that. You can see if I try to select that same exact date and then I try to select a time, you can see now that 3:45 is taken, it makes me either choose 3:15 or 4:15. So it perfectly syncs with Google Calendar. And if you go into your Google Calendar and, for example, let's delete this event right here, come back to our page, and then we can give this a quick refresh so we can get our new list of events. Let's select that exact same day. And now you can see that we have more meeting times available because we removed that meeting from 2 to 3 o'clock. It's even smart enough to know if we select something like this that has a very long event time of over 2 hours, and we try to go in here, you'll notice that September 4th is actually completely blocked off because there's no time slots left that have enough time. If we choose Thursday, you can see we have lots of options, but Wednesday is completely booked up, so we can't even choose it. So in this video, you're going to learn how to build all of this using Next.js with the latest and greatest features, and we're going to be using Clerk for our authentication, which gives us amazing features for managing our user account. We're going to be using Postgres and Neon for our database with Drizzle as our ORM, and we're going to use Tailwind CSS and ShadCN to style everything, and that's because it makes it really easy to style things like this switch toggle or these form fields. And we even have validation on all of our form fields using Zod. Everything's going to be in TypeScript. This is going to be a super modern project that's going to show you how you can build a large scale project and expand it to literally any project that you want to build. Welcome back to Web Dev Simplified. My name is Kyle, and my job is to simplify the web for you so you can start building your dream project sooner. And the very first thing that we need to do is go ahead and create a Next.js application. So we can say npx create next app, and we just want to create it in the same folder, so we'll use a period. And to make sure we're using the latest version, we'll use @latest at the end here. Now I'm going to go through and select TypeScript and ESLint and Tailwind and the source directory and app router. And finally, I don't really care about modifying the import alias. Essentially, I'm selecting yes to everything but the import alias. And that's just because I want to use TypeScript and Tailwind for this project because it's the most modern and type safe way to do everything. It generally just makes you write better applications. Now, once we have that done, we should just be able to run npm run dev. And that should start up our application on localhost 3000. So if I refresh the page over here, we should hopefully see that in just a second, it'll pop up with the main page that's generated for us by Next.js, which is just everything inside of this layout in this page, which we really don't care too much about. As you can see, we have that information over here. Now to actually get started with things, I want to go over and install ShadCN because that's what we're going to be using for our project. So we can just come along here and go to the documentation on how to get this started. And there should be a section on installation if we just go a little bit further into the documentation. There you go. You can see we have installation right here. We're going to be doing Next.js, and this will tell us exactly what we need to do. In our case, we can just run this npx shadcn init command. So we'll just come over here, run that command real quick, and it'll ask us a few things on what we actually want to do with ShadCN. For example, the different theme we want to use, base color, and so on. So in our case, it really doesn't matter what you choose for most of these. It's kind of a personal preference, whether you like the New York theme or the default theme. I'm going to go ahead and just select the default theme. Again, do whatever you think is best. Same thing for the color here. Doesn't really matter. I'm just going to go with slate for this coloring. And then CSS variables, I would recommend using yes, just because it'll make it easier to style your colors in the future because you can use things like primary instead of having to select like blue 500. Now, once we have that done, if we scroll down, you can see all of this has already been configured for us. Now what we can do is we can add anything we want. For example, a button is probably the first thing we're going to need in our application, so I can copy that over, and that's going to add a button component to our actual code. If we look in the source here, you can see this lib folder has this nice utility function for adding different class names, And then we have a components folder and a UI folder, which contains all the code for a button inside of ShadCN. So super easy. I'll show you how we use this in just a little bit. Now, the next step that I want to do is just get rid of a lot of the defaults that are in there for Next.js. So for example, in our globals, all this stuff at the top here, all the way up to the layer of base, we can essentially remove. All this stuff in layer base and down here, layer base, that's all added by ShadCN for all the CSS variables we'll need. Also, inside of this page here, I essentially just want to get rid of every single thing that's inside this page. So we'll just get all of this, export default function home page. And for now, we'll just return null, so we have absolutely nothing on the page. And in our layout, I essentially want to clean this up as well. So to make using my font a little bit easier, what I can do for this inter font right here is I can come in and I can add a variable for it. And we'll just call this -- font sans. There we go. So now what I can do down here is I can actually add this as the variable. So this will use a variable version instead of a class name version, which means I can actually set this as a Tailwind style as well. So in my Tailwind config, I can extend the font family selector. And for my sans font, I can extend it to use that variable of font sans. There we go. So essentially now it's going to be using the font sans font first anytime I use a font family of sans. And I can also come in here and I can add in all the existing font families for .sans. So I can actually import those real quick at the very top here. So import font family. And I want to get that from Tailwind CSS / default theme. There we go. So it's going to get me all the default font sans. So just in case this font doesn't load for some reason, it'll just fall back to the default ones used inside of Tailwind. So now I have that inside of my layout. The final thing that I really want to add in here is just a few more class names. So to really easily add class names together, we can use this CN library. This is what's actually added to us by the ShadCN, and this allows us to really easily take certain strings, for example, a min height of screen, just to make sure this fills the full height, and also so we can give it the background color, and we can just use the CSS variable of BG background. That's because we're using the CSS variables. I want to have that font sans inside of here. So we know based on our Tailwind config that that's going to be using either our variable for font sans or whatever the fallback values are. And then finally, I want to just add anti-aliased into here, and then we can just put a comma and close that off. And if we give that a quick save, you can see we have all of our custom classes as well as any CSS variable classes that we need in there. Now that should be all we need to do to give us a nice little background color. And if I just come in here, npm run dev, and we open up our application again at localhost and give it a quick refresh, we should hopefully see that we have a nice little darker background color showing up. Now, before we get too far ahead of ourselves, I am going to slightly modify some of our CSS variables. So our background here, I'm actually going to change this to a 210, a 40%, and 99% here. If I give that a quick save, we can see that makes a very slight change to our background over on the right-hand side. I'm also going to make some very minor changes to our primary color as well. So here, I'm going to use 201 instead of 222. And then I'm going to come in here with a 96%, and then finally a 32% right here. And this again is just going to slightly change what our blue color looks like to align a little bit more with the styles that we want. Lastly, I'm going to change our dark mode as well. So here we can use 222, but this is going to be 47%. And then finally, I want to change this to be 6%. And then we can change our primary color down here as well. So this is going to be 199. This is going to be 89%. And this right here is going to be 48%. Again, just to give us a slightly different colors to look exactly like we want our application to. So now with that out of the way, we can actually work on our homepage. So if we go to our homepage right here, this is going to be a very basic homepage because the bulk of our application is behind the homepage after you sign in, or if you're on like a scheduling page. We don't really care what the homepage looks like. That's for like the designers and the front end people to worry about. We're worried more about the functionality. So for this, I'm going to make it very simple. It's essentially just going to be two sign-in buttons, a sign-in and a sign-up button, as well as some very basic text. So here, let's add in a class name on our div because we want to have some large text in the center of our screen. And we're going to use the container class with some margin on the top and bottom of 4. Also, just to make sure that this is centered, we'll come in here with an MX auto. That'll make sure that our container is centered if it needs to be smaller than the screen size. Then the next thing we can do is actually add in whatever our heading is. We can just say fancy homepage. Now, if I give it a save, you can see we have that fancy homepage showing up. And I can even make it a little bit bigger. We'll say text 3XL. And we'll put some margin on the bottom. So we have a very large just text on the screen. Imagine this is just any homepage with all the fancy designs and animations that you could ever want. Finally, we're going to have a div with some buttons inside of it. These are going to be for signing up and so on. So we'll add in a class name here with flex, a gap of 2, and we're going to justify these in the center. And finally, we can add in our buttons. We can actually use the buttons from ShadCN. So we have our first button here, and we can give this whatever text we want, like sign in, copy this down, and we can have a sign up button just like that. So now we have our two buttons for signing in and signing up. Now this seems about as good as time as any to actually worry about the sign up and sign in workflow. And for that, we're going to be using Clerk. So all you need to do is go to Clerk. I'll leave a link in the description for you and create an account. And Clerk is actually kind enough to be sponsoring this video along with Neon. So a huge thank you to them because their support is really what lets me create these applications for you and share them entirely for free. And I honestly love Clerk and Neon. They're both amazing products. And you'll really see that in this video with how great and easy they are to work with. So for Clerk, we're just going to create a brand new application. And inside of here, we can give it whatever name that we want. For example, this can be Calendly clone. And then for our sign up process, all we want to do is enable Google because we're going to be syncing this with Google Calendar. We want people to sign in with Google. So we're just going to enable Google. But as you can see, there's tons of different options you can do. Then we're going to create our application, which should be relatively quick. And all we need to do is just go through the setup steps. So in our case, we're going to click Next.js and we can just follow all these steps. So first, we're going to install Clerk. So let's come in here and we're going to install that Clerk library for Next.js. Then we're going to copy over all of our different environment variables that we need. So let's go over and we should just be able to create a .env.local, which will contain all of our local environment variables. There you go. We can see we have both of those pasted in. Obviously, you'll want to keep your secret key private. I'm showing you mine purely for educational purposes, but I'll be deleting it after this video, so it won't actually work for you. Then we can go ahead and update our middleware. So I'm just going to copy this. Inside of our source folder is where we need to create a file called middleware.ts. Essentially, this runs before every single request inside of Next.js, and it's just going to call this Clerk middleware function. Now we can add extra things in here to make certain routes public or private and so on. So we can do lots of configuration. For now, this is just going to mean everything is publicly accessible to everyone, but we can go ahead and configure that later. Finally, we need to wrap our entire application in this Clerk provider. So you can see there's a Clerk provider right here. So in our layout that covers everything, let's just wrap the entire thing in a Clerk provider. And this is going to give us access to the signed in user and so on everywhere inside of our application. And with that, we're literally done. That's all we need to do. So if we scroll up just a little ways, you can see that they have a sign in button and they have a user button, and they also have abilities for sign up as well. So what we can do on our page, if we go back to that where we have our sign in button, we can use the sign in button directly from Clerk, just like that. And it actually automatically has the text sign in it. And we can just put that inside of our own button component, say as child, and that's just going to style it exactly like we want. So if we give that a quick save and we move back over to our application, you'll now see we have a sign in button and a sign up button, but this sign in button is actually rendered by Clerk and allows us to actually do a sign in workflow. Same thing here. I'm going to do this one as a sign up button, just like that. Close that off. And you can see if I put this button on its own, I just put it like right here and get rid of this button, and I give it a quick save, and I give us a refresh over here, you'll notice that my sign up button is going to look quite a bit different. Also, I should probably run my application. But you'll notice if we give that a quick save and now refresh it, that we have our sign in button, and our sign up button has no styles at all. That's because we have Tailwind removing all those styles. And that's again why I'm using this button component to wrap it, just to give it our own styles. So now we have a sign in and a sign up button. And if I click, for example, on the sign up button, it's going to redirect me to the sign up page. And right here, the only option I have is Google. But again, if you configured other things like email password, or you have pass keys, or maybe like Discord or GitHub, they'll all be inside of here. So I can go ahead, I can click continue with Google, and it allows me to choose an account. Let's just choose this test account that I've created. I'll click continue, and there we go. We now are signed in as that particular user, and we can see information about that user using this really fancy user button component. So let me just get that component in there, give that a quick save, and now you can see that it renders our profile picture, opens up this pop-up, and allows me to manage every single thing that I want to do about my account, just like this, all inside this modal. And obviously, if you're on, for example, a smaller screen size, it's not going to be quite as large, but I use a larger screen size when I'm recording just because it makes it easier for you to see. But again, it lets you configure literally everything you want, which is super nice. Now, I am going to do a small amount of customization to our sign in and sign up workflow, because currently, if we click on sign in or sign up, it actually redirects us to information related to Clerk. Looks like it's Clerk's own pages. So let's just sign out real quick. So we'll click sign out, and then we'll click the sign in button. And you'll notice in the URL up here, it's something that's not actually our page, it's some Clerk page, and we want to host those inside of our application. So to do that is actually relatively easy. All we need to do is inside of our app, we'll create a folder, which we'll call auth in parentheses. This is a route group. It's not required. It just helps us separate the different sections of our application. And then inside of here, we're going to create a folder called sign up. And we're going to do the exact same thing with a folder called sign in. Make sure that is actually a folder. There we go, sign in. And I want to make sure that sign in folder is in our auth folder. Then in each of these folders, we create a brand new folder that's going to be doing a catch-all. So we can have the double parentheses like this, followed by triple dots, and then we can call this sign in and close that back off. This is just how Clerk sets up your own sign-in pages because of the way it does different redirecting and so on. Same thing here in the sign up folder. we'll do the triple dots. This time we'll call it sign up. And inside of both of these, we can create a page.tsx. And inside of here is where we can render what our actual sign up page is going to look like. And the really nice thing is Clerk gives us all the components we need out of the box, so we don't actually need to worry about creating our own page if we don't want to. But of course you can if you want to. So for our sign in page, it's incredibly easy. All we need to do is export our page. So we have a default function page. And inside of here, I'm just going to return the sign in component directly from Clerk. That's literally all I need to do. So I'm just going to copy that over to here. So we have our sign in, and then this one was actually for sign up. So let me make sure I use sign up instead. There we go. And that's all I need to do to render out those pages. So if I go to my sign in page, it's still going to redirect me to this Clerk version, and that's because I need to make one more change. All we need to do is go down into our environment variables section, and we need to add in some new environment variables. These are next public Clerk sign in URL and sign up URL, and just set them to /signup and /signin. All this does is tell Clerk where we actually have our sign up and sign in pages. And I'm going to separate all of our public variables down here just so it's a little bit easier to separate them from each other. So now if we just give our page a quick refresh, we click sign in, you'll notice it's now redirecting me to my own sign in page. It's at my own local host URL. You'll notice the styling's not quite what I want because all it's doing is rendering out this component. So to style it where I want, I'm going to actually inside my auth folder, create a layout.tsx file, and that's just going to wrap both of our sign up and sign in page. So inside of here, I can come in, export default function auth layout, just like that. And this is going to be taking in some children. So we can have children, and I can type the children as a React node. There we go. And then down here, I can just return a div that's going to wrap everything and put it in the right place. So I'm actually just going to copy this because it's really not interesting to watch me type that out. All we're doing is we're making it so it's full screen, flexing it so it's positioned in the center with all of this information here. And now you can see we have this directly centered in our screen, which looks super great. So if I actually do sign in, I click continue with Google, sign it in as that actual account of mine that I've created. You can now see we have that user profile showing up and everything else looks great. Now, the final thing I want to do is if the user is already signed in, I just want to redirect them away because I don't want them to be able to sign in multiple times. So for example, we can come in here, we can get our user ID, and that comes from calling this auth function, just like this. This gives us our user ID as well as a bunch of other information, but for our case, all we really care about is the user ID, because if the user ID is not equal to null, well, that means our user is signed in, so we should probably redirect them. So we're going to come in here, and we're just going to redirect them to our homepage. So if they're already signed in, just redirect them to the homepage. I'm going to make sure I import the correct redirect. There we go. So now if I'm already signed in, you can see I click the sign in button and it just redirects me back to the home page. Same thing with sign up. When I click on this, it just redirects me back to the home page. Now with the similar logic, I'm actually going to copy this and I'm going to go over to our layout, or not our layout, but our home page. And on our home page, if we're already signed in, I don't want to show them this home page. I want to redirect them directly to the application. So we'll use that same exact auth function here, and we'll use the same exact redirect function. But the only difference is I'm going to redirect them to a page called /events. And that's where they're going to go to be able to create brand new events. Because if you sign in, you can create an event and then share that with someone else to have them book an event on your calendar. So now you can see when I save that, it redirected me to localhost /events, but right now we have no page for that. So to create this page, what I'm going to do back into my application, I'm going to create another route group, again, just to make it easier for me to actually organize. And this is going to be called private. And while I'm at it, I'm going to create another route group called public. And this is just so that I have all of my different private routes, for example, the things you must be signed in to use, as well as the public routes like scheduling something on someone's calendar, separated from each other so they're easier for me to work with. Now inside this private one, I'll create a folder called events, and inside of here I can create a page, and we'll just export the default function, events page. And for now, we'll just return an H1 that says events. There we go. Make sure I spell everything correctly. And as you can see, it now just says events at the top of our page. Now this events page is something that I want to be completely private. So let's really quickly go in here. I'm going to add in the ability for us to be able to sign out. So I'm going to add that user profile section, user button, just like that. Give it a quick save. So now if I click on this, I can actually sign out and sign in and so on. But I want to make sure this events page is completely private, because right now if I sign out and I just manually navigate to /events, I can get to this page, but I don't want to. This is where this middleware comes in. Now this Clerk middleware actually takes in a function that gives us all of our auth information, as well as all the information related to our request. And what we can do is we can call auth.protect, and that's going to essentially make it so that this page cannot be accessed unless you're currently logged in. Right now, this is going to run on every page, which means every single page in our application is completely inaccessible. Instead, we want to have some pages that are public. So we'll just create this public route. So we'll say is public route. And we're going to set that equal to create route matcher. There we go. And this create route matcher, all it's going to do is it's going to take in an array of all the different routes that we want to be public. And it uses the exact same format down here as you use for this matcher. So for example, our home page, we want to be public. We also want to make sure that our sign-in page is public. And our sign-in page, since as you can see, it's nested inside this sign-in page with this sign-in parameter, what we can do is just put in these parentheses with a dot and a star inside of it and close that off. And that's just going to say match anything that starts with sign on. So we can do the exact same thing with sign up. So we have sign in, paste that down, and we'll do sign up. And there we go. Now we have 3 routes that are listed as public. So what we can do is we can say if our route is public, and we can pass in our request, and we can come in here and do something. So if our route is not public, we can say that it needs to be protected. And now immediately, if we give this a refresh, we should hopefully see that we are redirected back to the sign-in page because we were on a private page. Now, if I wanted to, I could redirect myself to the home page. This is a public page. Everything works fine. And if I sign in and I come in here and I go to this actual page, you can see I can access this events page because I'm currently signed in and it's protected, but as soon as I sign out, it's going to redirect me back to the home page. So now pretty much every application page that I create is going to be private by default unless I put it inside this array of publicly facing pages. This is really nice because it means every page I add will by default be private, which means I don't accidentally expose something I don't want to. Now, before we can really get too far into our events page, we obviously need to be able to have a way to store information in a database. So I want to go ahead and get set up with our database. And for our database, we're going to be using Neon, which is a Postgres database hoster, and we're going to be using Drizzle as our ORM. So the first thing we want to do is get set up by creating a project on Neon. Now again, Neon is sponsoring this video, but I absolutely love their servers and wouldn't be working with them if I didn't think it was amazing, and I'll show you why I really like it. So we're going to come in here, we'll call this Calendly clone, call it whatever you want. And again, for our database, we'll call it Calendly, doesn't really matter. And we can put whatever region we want, and we can just come in here and create the project. So now you can see, I'll make this a little bit larger so it's easier. Our project is completely ready. And the really nice thing that I love about Neon is you have the ability to actually branch out and create different branches. So for example, I have a main branch, which may be like my production version of my application, but I can also create different development branches for each individual developer, as well as things like a staging branch and so on. So you don't have to worry about conflicting with other people. So let's come in here, I'll click create dev branch, and now you can see a branch has been created called dev/Kyle, just because I'm logged in under the account with the name of Kyle. Now what I can do is I can actually connect to this directly using any of these different things. I have a bunch of different providers here, a bunch of information on how to connect. Now we don't really need to follow this too closely because we're going to be using Drizzle for this. So all I really need is this URL right here, which is our database URL. So we're going to copy this completely and we're going to put it inside of our environment variables. So up here in our private variables, we're going to have a database URL. I'm just going to paste that in. And again, you want to make sure you keep this private. I'm only showing you mine for the tutorial purposes. Now let's go back over and look at Neon again. As you can see, another nice thing is you can add different, branches and so on for CI/CD, a bunch of different stuff. But really, that's all we need to do for development. We just create the dev branch, and now we're working on a separate branch entirely only working with us. So we don't have to worry about stepping on anyone's toes. We can also view our database and switch between the branches so we can view all the tables for this particular branch. Now the next step is to be able to hook up Neon with Drizzle, which is incredibly easy to do. It's super nice. All we need to do is make sure we install all of our Drizzle stuff. So we're going to copy over these commands. I'm going to paste them into our console down here to install all the information we need. And then you want to copy this code and we can put this anywhere we want. In my particular case, I'm going to create a brand new folder called Drizzle for all my Drizzle related code. I'm going to create a file called db.ts, which is where I'm going to put everything inside of here. And this just allows us to connect to our database. So we can get rid of this select statement. And instead, I just want to export the database. So we can say export const db, and that's going to allow us to use the database anywhere in our application, and it's getting that process environment variable directly from our env file. Now, the final thing you need to do to be able to work with Drizzle is just to create a configuration file so that all of our different commands will work. So we'll create a file called drizzle.config.ts, and this is actually created at the root of our application. And inside here, I'll paste this code and explain what's going on. We're using this define config function, which comes from Drizzle, and then we're just saying where we want to put all of our different files. So our schema file is going to be in that Drizzle folder, and it's going to be called schema.ts. So inside that Drizzle folder, you can see I can create a new file, schema.ts, and this is where our schema is going to go. Then we want to output all of our migrations in a folder called migrations inside that Drizzle folder. We're using Postgres for our database. And then these final options of strict and verbose just make it so that you're a little bit more careful when you're applying changes to your database. It's going to make sure to ask, are you okay with these changes and so on, just to make sure you know what's going on. And finally, our URL is going to be pasted in here so it knows how to connect to our database. So if we just give all of this a quick save, we have everything working and we should be able to connect directly with Drizzle and connect with our Neon database, which is super nice. Now the next step in our application is actually defining the schema for all the different rows and data that we have inside of our application. So to do this is relatively simple. All we need to do is export variables for each of our tables. So we'll export a constant variable and we'll call it whatever our table name is going to be. So for example, we have our event table. This is where we store all of our different events. And that's going to be set equal to PG table. And that's because we're working with Postgres, so it's called PG table. If you were working with MySQL, it would be like MySQL table or something similar. Then we can give our table a name, so we'll call this events because it's our events table. And then we give it an object to specify all the different rows and columns we have. So for example, we can have an ID column, which will make a UUID. We'll give it the name of ID. Then we can say that this is going to be a primary key, and we want to default it to a completely random UUID. So this is going to be the primary key for our table. Then we can come in here, we can say that we're going to have a name for each one of our different events, and this is just going to be a text field. And again, make sure we get that from the PG core. Everything we're working with comes from PG core because we're working directly with Postgres. So again, we'll give it a name of name, and we're going to say that this must be defined. You can't have a null name on your event. And this event is like what people schedule with you. So in the intro, when people were scheduling like a quick call, that was the name, quick call. Then we can come in here with a description. So let's make sure we have a description. There we go. This is going to be another text field called description. And this description is optional, so we'll just leave it as is. Finally, we're going to have a duration in minutes. This one is going to be an integer. Make sure, again, we get it from that PG core, duration in minutes. And again, not null, just like that. Finally, we need to have our user ID, and I'm going to prefix this with Clerk user ID because this is the user ID directly from Clerk. That way, if you ever swapped your provider for Auth or anything like that, you would know which IDs were specifically for Clerk. It makes it a little bit easier to work with. We're just going to say that this is a text field because that's how Clerk stores their user IDs. And we'll call this Clerk user ID. And again, this cannot be null. Every event must be tied to a particular user. Finally, we have a Boolean that we can determine if this is active or not. So we'll say that's a Boolean, just like that, is active. And we have to make sure we specify this. And by default, we're going to say that they are all active. This just really easily makes it so we can activate or deactivate different events without actually deleting them entirely. Then finally, I want to add a created at and an updated at field, but this is something I'm probably going to add to every single table in my database. So what I want to do is actually come up here and create a created at row and an updated at row. And I'm going to define these using a timestamp. So we're going to say timestamp from Postgres. This one's going to be called created at. It is not null, and we're going to default it to the current time. So now every single row is going to have this created at being added to it. And the updated at is going to be very similar. I'm just going to call this updated at. Again, it's going to be not null. I want to default it to now, and I want to call this on update function. So on update, I want to call a particular function, which just gives me a brand new date. So now every single time I update something, it's going to get the new date automatically. And the really nice thing about this is I can just add these fields to every single table I want incredibly easily. Speaking of, we're probably going to go on to our next table. So we can export a const, which is our schedule table. And that's just a PG table, just like that. Schedules, there we go. This takes in an object, just like that. And before I move on to the schedule table, there's one final thing I want to add to this table, and that is an index. And that's because I'm generally going to be searching for all the events by a particular user ID. That's a very common task. For example, on this event page, after I actually sign into my application, my events page is going to need to have all the events for a particular user. So adding an index is just going to make that a little bit more efficient. So I can get all the information from my table, and here I can return down exactly what I want. In my case, I want to have a Clerk user ID index. Set that equal to calling index, again, from that Postgres library, Clerk user ID index. I'm going to set that on the table.clerk user ID. So essentially, I'm just creating an index on this particular column. Now, for doing the scheduling, every single user is going to have one single schedule in this table. And I'm actually just going to real quickly copy over the data and explain it in depth. So here we have an ID, just the primary key of our table. Then we specify what time zone their schedule is in, because they're going to enter their information for their schedule like so. They're going to be like 7 o'clock, or like it's going to be 1400, so that'd be 2 p.m. for example. They're going to enter their schedule in that type of format. So we want to be able to convert this format to whatever time zone they are currently in. So they need to have a time zone and obviously a user ID to associate with this schedule. Then we're going to have another table that stores each of those time slots that they enter. So we can have a const schedule availability table. And that's PG table. And this one will be called schedule availability. We'll just call it availabilities. There we go. Make sure we pass it in an object. And let me make sure I spell abilities correctly. Now again, I'm just going to copy this over and I'll explain exactly what it does. So the very first thing we have is a primary key for our ID. The next thing here is our schedule ID, and this references our schedule table. So essentially each time slot, as you can see, has a start time and an end time, which is just a string, again, in that format of like 7 o'clock or 9 o'clock, something like that. So we have a start time of 7 and an end time of 9. Those are just the strings we store, and we associate it with a schedule, which has a user and a time zone. So we know how to convert all these different values. This references field just tells me that I'm referencing this particular table. And whenever I delete this particular table up here, I want to delete all the references to that table in this availability section as well. So if a user deletes their schedule entirely, it should delete all of these schedules down here as well. Finally, the day of week is going to be an enum that I'm going to create. And essentially, this is just going to be all the different days, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, all the way through to Sunday. So to create that enum, we can come in here, export a const schedule day of week enum, and that is PG enum. And we can give it a name. We can call it day. Doesn't really matter. And to get these, I'm actually going to be, instead of just passing in the array, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, so on, I'm actually going to store this in a variable that I can access other places. So I'm going to come over here into my source folder, create a folder called data, which is a folder I like to create for any constant information that I have. So we're going to call this constants.ts. And in here is where I'm going to create that variable. So let's just paste that down. You can see we have all the days of the week in order. This goes Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. And I'm making sure to store this as a constant variable in TypeScript. So it knows that if I try to access any of these days a week in order, that I essentially have access to only the columns of Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, so on. So now we can go back into our schema, and I can use the days of week in order to actually define what that schema looks like. So now if I try to define a day of week, it must either be Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, or Sunday. So I have some type safety in my database right there. Now I also want to set up an index on this table. So for example, we're going to be sorting by this schedule ID a lot. So I'm going to add in a quick index for that. So you can see a schedule ID index is just indexing on that particular row inside of our table. And I know I'm copying and pasting quite a few things around. I'm mostly doing that because it's easier than watching me type it out. It's going quicker, and hopefully this is relatively self-explanatory what we're going through. So now that we have our schedule availability and our schedule done, I want to be able to create relations between them so that I can really easily create join queries instead of writing my joins by hand. So I can come in here, I'm going to export a constant called schedule relations. I'm going to set that equal to calling relations from the Drizzle ORM. I need to pass it in what the table name I'm using is. So I have my schedule table. And then finally, I'm going to be passing it down a function. And this function is actually going to take an object as the return value to define all my relations. So I can get all the availabilities. So availabilities. There we go. And I can say that this is going to be a relation that's either going to be a one-to-one or many-to-one or so on relation. This is going to be a many relation because each schedule has many schedule availabilities. So we can come in here, say this is a many pointing to my schedule availability table. So every schedule has many schedule availabilities. I can do the exact same thing for my schedule availability table. Export const schedule availability table. There we go. And this is going to be relations. And that's calling that relations function, passing it in my table. There we go. And then again, it's going to be taking in a function. Just like that, it's going to be returning this object. And in this case, we have a one-sided relation because each availability has one schedule. So we can say schedule, there's going to be one of those, specify what the table is, which is our schedule table. And we also need to specify the fields. So we can say fields here, and this is essentially going to be what field contains the foreign key for our table. So that's our schedule ID. So we can say schedule availability table, and we want to get the ID column from there. Then we need to specify which column it references in the other table. And this references the schedule table.id column. So we're just saying we have one schedule that points from this schedule ID to this schedule table. And now if we give that a quick save, that's everything we need to set up all of our data in our database. The main things we have is we have this event table that contains all the different events people can schedule. Then we have this schedule table, which sets up the time zone for our user. And then finally the schedule availability, which is all the time slots they have available for each individual day. Now to actually interact with our database and be able to push changes and so on, I'm going to add a few different things to our package JSON. So inside of here, I'm just going to put a comma, come down here. these are going to be db generate, migrate, and studio, and all it does is call Drizzle kit generate, migrate, or studio. So it allows us to generate migration files, it allows us to run those migration files, and it allows us to open up a studio, which allows us to actually view our data. We can also do that in Neon if we want, but it gives us multiple different ways we can do that. So what I can do is I can run npm run db generate, and it should hopefully generate migrations for our particular schema. So you can see it's actually gone through and generated migrations. Inside that migration folder, you can see that this is all of the SQL code that needs to be run to create all of the different stuff related to our database. Now, if we want to migrate that up to our actual Neon database, we can run the migrate command, just like this. And this is actually going to push those changes. But you will notice it's actually saying that we don't have an ID being passed, or not an ID, a URL being passed in. And that's because by default, it looks for a .env file instead of .env local. So a relatively easy way we can get around this is we can just rename this to .env, just like that. And then inside of our get ignore, we can make sure that we also ignore .env. There we go. And now it's going to remove .env from it. And hopefully now if we run this, we should actually see that it's going to push up all those changes to our database. You can see everything ran successfully. If we come over here and we refresh our page, make this a little bit bigger so we can see, you can now see we have all three of these different tables inside of our database. And if we had data inside of there, we could see all that information, but we can interact, add records and so on if we want to inside of our database here. Now, another thing I really like to do on my larger scale applications is I like to not only just have a .env file, but I like to have a .env example. So we'll call this .env .example. And this example file is going to be the same as my normal env, but I'm going to remove all the values for every single one of my sensitive, especially database queries, or not database queries, but environment variables. So I'm going to come in here and just remove literally everything sensitive. I can leave these ones in because it really doesn't matter what these routes are. They need to be the same no matter what. So I'll keep those in, but the rest of these I'm going to completely clear out. And now you can see that this environment variable example file is going to be pushed up to my repository. So when someone downloads the repository, they'll see, okay, I need to add these three particular environment variables, and these two are already set up for me. So every time you add something to your .env, I would recommend adding an empty version to your .env.example, just so people know what environment variables they need to add to your project. So now let's go ahead and actually work on our application. We'll call npm run dev to open up our application. We already have all of our changes pushed to our database, which is great. So now we can actually start interacting with it in our application. Just gonna give this a quick refresh. So we should be on the events page. Let me just sign in real quick. There we go. So I hopefully, yep, there we go. I'm on the events page. So let's go ahead and first of all, in our app, in this private folder, I'm going to create a brand new file called layout.tsx. And this is going to be the layout that wraps all of our different private files. So let's come in here. We're going to export a default function, private layout. This is going to take in some children. And this is going to be a React node. There we go. And inside of here, we can return essentially a bunch of information. First of all, I want to have a header section. And then finally, below the header, I'm going to have my main content, which is just going to render out my children. But I'm going to render them out inside of a container just to make sure that their spacing is a little bit nice and add some margin on the top and the bottom. So now if we give that a quick save, we can see we have our events shown. They have a little bit of margin. And as my screen size increases, and I zoom this out, it looks like things are pushed very far off to the side, but I believe if I come in here with an MX of auto, it should hopefully center things if I create a larger screen size. As you can see, it is now centering that information. Let me just zoom this back in though, so it's a little bit easier to work with. Also, I believe if I want to make this a little bit easier so I don't even need to add this MX auto by default, what I can do is in my Tailwind config, which I have down here, inside of my theme section, I want to just add in a section for container. So I can say container. By default, I want to center this. I also want to add in some padding. We'll say 2 rem. There we go. And then finally at the very bottom here, I want to say for my screens, anytime I have a 2XL size screen, I want to set it to be 1400 pixels. There we go. So now if I give that a save, you can see I now have that padding on the side, and also on very large screen sizes, you can see it's now centered inside of my screen. So now let's go ahead, shrink this back down, and we can actually go ahead and work on styling out all the other stuff inside of our header. So this header is really just going to contain our nav links as well as this user profile button that we have right here. So let's come in here for our header. I want to add some class names to this. We're going to say flex. We're going to have some padding on the top and bottom of 2. We're going to have some border on the bottom, which is just going to be a line. And we're also going to specify a background of card, just so that we can actually have a slightly wider background to this. So now you can see at the top here, I have this header section with no content inside of it quite yet. Now what I can do is add in a navigation section inside of here. Inside of that navigation, I want my font to be a medium font. I want to flex my items again. I want to put them in the center. and I want to make the text a little bit smaller and add pretty large spacing of a gap of 6 between them. And I'm also going to add that same exact container class. So now I give that a quick save. So far, nothing's changed, but if I put some content inside of here, you can see it's got some nice spacing and it also has the exact same padding to line everything up. That's why this container class is on there. Now inside of the nav, I essentially want 3 separate sections. The first is going to be for my logo for my application. So we're going to come in here with a flex, items in the center again, a gap of only 2 because I want my logo and the name of my logo to be very close. We're going to use some semi-bold font. And then finally, I'm going to put the margin on the right of auto just to make sure that this is all the way on the far left-hand side of my screen. Now the logo I'm going to be using is just coming from the Lucid React icons library, which comes with ShadCN. So I want to get that calendar range icon. And I'm going to say that it's going to be a size of 6. Give that a quick save. And now in the top left corner, we have that calendar icon showing up. I also want to have a span, and this is going to say calendar, which is going to be the name of our application. Doesn't really matter. But I'm going to make sure that this only shows up for screen readers unless our screen size is at least medium or larger, and then it's going to show up for everybody. So right now you can see it's hidden, but as I increase my screen size, let's increase it a little bit more, you can now see that that text shows up because our screen size is larger. So now we can shrink that back down. And the next thing I want to work on is going to be adding in my user button, because in the middle is where we're going to have our links. So let's come in here and we're going to add a little div with a class name. Margin on the left is auto, again, to push it as far right as possible. And finally, we're going to add a size of 10 to make this a rather large button. Then we're going to have our user button and render that information out on the screen. So we give a save, you can see our user button is being rendered, but to make sure that it actually fills the full space and works properly, we need to modify the appearance of this. So I can come in here and say that I want to pass in some appearance for a particular element, and I want to use the user button avatar box, just like that. And all I want to do is I want to say that my size is going to be full. So I'm just applying the size full class. As you can see, we now get this very large icon showing up. You can make it larger or smaller. It really depends on your preferences, but now we have a rather large icon showing up for that section. Now, finally, we need to have our links for our navigation. I'm going to create a custom component called navlink for this. So we can pass it in our URL, for example, /events is going to go to events. And then we can have schedule, which is going to go to schedule, just like that. And now we can create this custom component. So over here, minimize our app in our components folder, we can create a brand new file called navlink.tsx. Now I'm just going to paste this in and kind of walk through the code because again, it doesn't really help you if I type it out. This navlink essentially is just going to be taking all the same components as the normal link inside of Next.js. The only thing is that I'm going to be separating out the class name, and all I'm doing is I'm checking what my current path is, and if the path is equal to that URL that I passed in, then I'm going to set it as an active style. So I'm just slightly changing my styling. So you can see if it's active, I have a text of foreground, while if it's inactive, I have this muted foreground text, and when I hover it, I give it that text of foreground. So essentially it gives it a hover effect, while when it's active, there's no hover effect. And I also make sure it transitions between all the different colors, so it has a nice little animation. So if I come over here and I make sure I go back to that layout page and import my nav link, there we go. We should now see we have those 2 links, and you can see when I hover it, it changes the color. And that's really all that the active and non-active styles are doing. Now, if I click schedule, obviously it's a 404 page because that doesn't exist, but I do have my event page, and you can see that does have the blacker color, and that's because that is our active page. So now we're finally ready to actually style out what this event page is going to look like. Obviously, we don't need this user button there anymore because we have it in our header, so we can completely remove that. But I do want to modify what my little nav or my page title section is going to be. So I'm going to wrap this inside of a div, move my h1 up inside of there, and I also want to put a button in here for creating a brand new event. So we'll say button. I'm going to use this as a child because all it's going to do is render out a normal link tag, and that's going to post us to that events/new page. And this will just say new event inside of it. And I'm also going to add in a plus icon. So we'll say calendar plus. That'll give us a nice little plus icon. And I can also change what this looks like by adding a little bit of styling. So I'm going to add a little bit of margin on the right to space things out and make it a size of 6 to make it a rather large button. So now let's add in our button like that. Give this a quick save, and now you can see we have this really large new event button, which looks great. Now the next thing I want to do is style what the events h1 looks like. So we can say that the text on this is going to be quite large at 3XL, and on larger screen sizes, we're going to make the text even larger, and on even larger screen sizes, we're going to make the text again even larger, just so it scales up. Then we'll say our font is going to be semi-bold, and finally the margin on the bottom is going to be 6. So you can see we now have that showing up, and just to make sure these buttons are side by side with our title, we can add a flex with a gap of 4 and set our items to be baseline There we go. Now you can see our button shows up right next to that event's title, which is great. Now the next thing we want to do is render out all the different events that we have. So we need to get those from our database. So we can say const events is equal to calling await, which means we'll need an asynchronous function. And we can actually get these from our database. So that database file that we created, if we go over to here, that's inside of our Drizzle folder. We created this DB file that exports our DB variable. That's exactly what we're using right here. And what we can do is we can do a query, which allows us to do some really nice queries without having to write them out by hand. And we can query on the event table. Now you will notice it's not actually working. I'm not getting my autocomplete, and it seems like I forgot to add the schema generic. So what I need to do is go back into here, and as a second parameter, I can pass it in a schema. So let's import our schema. So we can say we want to import star as schema from that schema file. So ./schema. And that's why in this schema file, everything we did was exported out of here. That way we can make sure we import it directly into here and actually use that properly. So now if we go back to this page, we have our event table and we actually get autocomplete on that. And we also get all of our other tables as well. So in our case, I want to do a find many because I want to get all of the different events that match a particular clause. And I want to do a where clause, which is going to take in a function. The first parameter of this function is going to be all my column IDs for my table. And then we have the second parameter, which is all the functions I can use. I'll show you what this does in just a second. But what I can do is I can say, you know what, I want to get the equal function. So we'll say equal, and I want to check the clerk user ID. So now I can say equals, pass it in the column I want to check, which is our clerk user ID. I want to compare that against the current user ID for our user. Well, to get our user ID, we already know that we can get that from the auth function. So we can say auth just like that. That's going to give us a user ID, but this could be null. So we'll do a quick check. If our user ID is equal to null, then we want to redirect them to the sign-in page. So we're going to say that we're going to get this from auth. There is a function called redirect to sign-in. All we need to do is call that, and it's going to redirect them directly to wherever our sign-in page is, even if we change where that's at. So now you can see this event is working. We'll even add in a simple order by, which is going to work essentially exactly the same. So we're going to have a function. First parameter is going to be the created at field, because that's what we're going to sort by. And we're going to sort in the descending direction. So we'll say descending, just like that, is going to be in our created at direction. And I need to make sure I put that parenthesis right there to make sure all of this works. And there we go. Now we have essentially a list of all of our different events. Now we are getting an error saying it couldn't find our database URL. If I go into our DB here, I think that's just because I called this database URL, just like that. So now if we give that a quick save, you can see that is connecting properly. So it's just a misspelling on my part. So now down here underneath of our main header section, what I want to do is I want to come in here. If our events.length is greater than 0, well, then I want to render something that just says, for now, we'll just say an H1 that says events. There we go. And then if we don't have any events, we want to render something different, essentially a little message that says, hey, you should probably add some events. So we'll come in here with a div. And inside that, we're going to add in the calendar range icon. I'm going to make this a very large icon. So we'll say class name, size of 16. And we're going to center that with an MX of auto. Then below that, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to have some text. I'll copy this over so I don't have to type it out. It says you do not have any events yet. Create your first event to get started. And then, of course, underneath that, we're going to put a giant button for creating an event. So let's just copy this button, paste it down below here. I'm going to make some minor modifications to this button. For example, I'm going to change the size to large. I'm going to change the class name on this to a text of large as well. Then we should be able to give that a quick save. And you can see we get that all showing up down here. All I want to do is inside this div, just make it so that's a flex column container. And I want to put my items in the center and just space them out a little bit. So now you can see that that looks a little bit better. And if we zoom out to a more reasonable screen size and make this a little larger, you can see that looks relatively good. I just have my screen quite scrunched up. So now if we don't have any events, we can click this button to create a brand new one, or this button up here. It's just a nice little message to be able to say, hey, you don't have any events yet, let's create one. And now that I clicked on the button, you can see it brought me to that page, but of course we have no events yet. So let's go ahead and make a form for creating an event so we can actually view those events. So in events, let's create a folder called new, and inside of here, we'll create page.tsx. So we can just run npx ShadCN at latest, add, and we want to get the card component. So that should hopefully add in that for us. And now you can see we have our card component right here. And to make this card work, I'm just going to paste this over real quick. We'll get rid of this section on the event form. But essentially all I have is a card that I'm going to make rather skinny, center in the screen with the title of new event. And then this is where our card content is going to go. So if I give this a quick refresh and I make sure I run our application, we should hopefully see a new page that says new event and then just has content in the middle of our card. There you go, new event with our content in the center of our card. Now inside of our card content, we obviously want to have an event form. And this event form is actually going to be a component we create in this components folder. I'm going to create a brand new folder called forms to put this event form inside of, because we're probably going to have quite a few forms in our application. So putting them all in one place is kind of nice. Export function event form. For now, we'll just return null, and then we can come over here and make sure that we actually import that. So event form, import just like that. So now we get rid of all of our errors and it's just rendering out nothing. Now for rendering out that event form, we're going to be using a lot of ShadCN components. So we can come in here and we can run that add command. And we want to add form. This is going to add Zod, React hook form, as well as some form components for us. Also, we want to add the input component, the switch component, the text area component, and then finally the alert dialog component, just so we can render out all the different information that we need. So this allows us to have really easy styling for our forms and so on. And since we're using React hook form and Zod, it makes all of our validation incredibly easy. You can see here the button file already exists. I don't want to overwrite that, so we'll just say no and continue on, and we've skipped right over that file. That's because if you want to make changes in this file, which we will be doing in this video, it'll be really easy. You don't accidentally overwrite those files. Now to get started on our form, the very first thing we need to do is to create a form variable, which is using the useForm hook. And this useForm hook is coming directly from React hook form. So we can come all the way up here, import useForm from, and we want to get that from React hook form. There we go. And this useForm hook is actually going to take in a schema object that we want to have, which we'll define using Zod. So we can define that really quickly up here, and then we'll move it into a more appropriate location. So we'll say schema equals Z, which we're going to get from Zod. So we'll say import Z from Zod. There we go. Z.object. And inside of here, we could do things like a name, which is a Z.string. Obviously, we want our schema to be more in-depth than this, but this is going to show you how to get everything set up. So first of all, to get our type, we can infer the type from the type of our schema, just like that. So this is going to give us the type that we're using for our form. And then finally, we can pass in all of our information. So our resolver is coming from the Zod resolver. So let's make sure we import Zod resolver, and that is from @hookform resolvers / Zod. There we go. And all this needs to do is take in our schema that we're going to be resolving down to. This is to do all of our different validation for us. So this section right here gives us type safety, and this gives us all the validation we define inside of our schema to make sure names are like given and so on. Then finally, we can pass in any default values that we want. For example, isActive is going to be set to true, and our duration in minutes is going to be set to 30. Now you will notice that we get errors on this, and that's because right now our schema doesn't have an isActive or duration in minutes value that we can use. So let's go ahead and actually define our schema. And to do that, I'm actually going to put it in its own file because we want to be able to use this in multiple places in our application. For example, in our actions as well as in our forms. So I'm going to create a brand new file here inside of a folder. We'll call this schema, and inside of here, we'll call this events. There we go, .ts. And then we can come in and we can export a constant called event form schema, and this allows us to define any schema we need for our events. So again, let's get an object, and this object is going to have quite a few things. So we're going to have a name, which is a string. We're going to give it a minimum of 1, and we're going to set this as required. So this is just saying the text that's going to show up if there's an error, and this is the validation. It must be at least 1 character long. Then we're going to have our description. There we go, description. This is going to be a string again, and this one is optional, so we'll just put in the optional flag. Also, we're going to have isActive. This one is a Boolean, and we're going to default this to true if we don't specify a value for it. And then finally, we have our duration in minutes. Now this one is going to be a number, and to make sure that this actually comes across as a value that I can use inside of my form, I'm going to do z.coerce. I'm going to coerce this into a number, so it's going to convert my string into a number since all form inputs come back as strings. Then I'm going to make sure that this is an integer, it doesn't have any decimal points. I want to make sure it's positive, and if it's not positive, I'm going to say duration must be greater than 0. Then I'm going to specify a maximum value, because obviously I don't want my duration to be too long. So my maximum is going to be 60 times 12, essentially 12 total hours, and it'll just say duration must be less than 12 hours. And then inside of here, I'm going to put 60 times 12 so they can see that in minutes as well. So There we go. Get that quick save. So it'll just say duration must be less than 12 hours or whatever that is in minutes if for some reason it goes longer than it should. So now in my form, I can actually use this event form schema. So in the place of this schema variable, I can just replace it with my event form schema and make sure I import that and get rid of this old schema. And you can see that cleans up my errors because now I have my isActive, which is a Boolean, and my duration in minutes, which is again a number. So now we have our form created with all of our type safety. The next thing I need is an onSubmit function. So this onSubmit function is going to take in all of my values, and they're just going to be the exact same type that I have here. I'm just going to copy this type actually, paste it down there. There we go. So it's just getting all the types from our schema and passing that into our onSubmit function. And for now, we'll just console.log those values so we can see what they look like. So now we have an onSubmit function. We have all of our type safety for our form. Now we can go ahead and use this form variable from ShadCN. And this just takes in everything from our form object. So we have our form component. And inside of our form component, we also need to put a form itself. So inside this form, we want to specify what the onSubmit is, which is that onSubmit function we created. So we can say form.handleSubmit and pass in our onSubmit. All this is going to do is it's going to translate all of the information from our form into an object that contains all the type safety information that we want. Then inside of our form, we can use the form field property from our ShadCN library, close that off. And this takes in quite a bit of information. The first thing we need to put inside of here is the control, which is just telling us where this form came from. So we can say form.control. So this is coming from that form object up here. Again, this helps us with our type safety. Then we can specify the name of this field. So is it our name field, our isActive, duration, or description field? This one will just be our name field. And then finally, we have a render prop here. And this is where we specify all the information for rendering. So this takes a function and it's going to render out an object. So for example, we can render out anything we want inside of here, but in our case, we're going to render out a form item, which again comes from ShadCN. Now each form item is going to contain a label. So we'll put in a form label. For example, this will be our event name. And then we're also going to have a form control. This is the thing that we're actually using for our input. And in our case, that is an input element. So we're going to get our input element just like that. And then finally, after our form control, we can add in any description we want. This is just going to be some random text. So the text for this one is just going to say the name users will see when booking. And then finally, form message is just going to display our error message if there is an error message. So I'm going to make sure that I import all of these different fields. So I get form control, get this imported as well. There we go. And now the only thing I have left to make sure I hook this up is this actually takes in a prop which contains our field. And all I can do down here is I can pass all of our field properties to our input. And that's going to make sure our input is properly hooked up with all of our form information. Again, to help us with all of that type safety. So now if we give this a refresh after we start our application, we should hopefully see we have one single input which says event name, and it's going to have a description of the name users will see when booking. So give that a refresh. And we can see once that refreshes, we have quite a few errors going on actually. The reason for this is because we are trying to use client-side hooks, but we're in a server-side component. So let me make sure that this says use client at the top. There we go, that cleaned that up. And now you can see we have this section for our event name, which is exactly what we want. And to show you all the validations working, I'm gonna scroll all the way down here. I'm gonna add in a div for adding some buttons. So we'll just say a flex with a gap of 2. And we're going to justify everything on the right-hand side. So that's to justify end. And I'm just going to type out these buttons. So we can say button. This one's going to be an as child with a variant of outline. And that's because this button is just going to be a link to go back to the events page. So we'll say href/events. And this will just say cancel. There we go. So let me just import these components real quick. There we go. Now those are working. And then finally, I'm going to copy this button down because we're going to have a second button here. This one's not going to be worried about an as child or anything like that. All I want to make sure is that this one is a type of submit, while up here, I'm going to specify this as a type of button so it doesn't accidentally submit our form. And then finally, inside of here, we can just put our text, which is save. There we go. So now if we click this save button right here, you can see it attempts to submit our form and it throws us errors because it actually cannot submit our form because this name field is required. Now you'll also notice things are super squished together, especially if I just refresh this page, you can see very, very squished together. So to fix that, we can add some styles on our form. Let's just come in here with a class name. We'll say a flex with a gap of 6, and we're going to do this in the column direction just to space things out. So each one of our fields will be spaced out from one another. And now this is as easy as just copying down my field and changing a few things. For example, this one, let's make it our duration in minutes. There we go. I can make the name here, duration, and this is going to be a type of number. So we can say type is equal to number because this is a number input. And then finally, this form description down here, we'll just say in minutes, so people know that this is a minutes field. As you can see, just like that. If I were to leave this off, completely delete it and save, you can see duration must be greater than 0. If I do something like 30, save, you can see it works. And if I make it a really large number, immediately you can see that the duration must be less than 12 hours. Now I'm going to copy in our next field area. This one is essentially identical. We changed the name to description, and we changed our input from an input to a text area. We made it so we can't resize it and so on. And now you can see down here, we have our description field. The final form field that we have inside of here is going to be our switch. So I'm going to go over this one because it's actually a little bit different than the rest. Again, our name is the same. We're changing around our classes a little bit because here we're rendering out this switch component inside of our form control. So our checked variable is just our field.value, and our onCheckChange corresponds to field.onChanged. So instead of just being able to pass the full field in here, I had to separate it out into its own properties just to make sure everything linked one-to-one to each other. Otherwise, everything else is the same. We have a description, we have a label. I just added a little bit of custom styling to make it so that everything lined up properly. So our label is to the right side of our switch. Because if I save, you can now see I get this switch component right here, which looks really, really good. So now we can actually test to see if this works. We already know up here that we have this console.log for all of our different values. So what we should be able to do is fill in some valid information. For example, 30, name, description, click save. And if we give an inspect on our page, we go over to the console, zoom this in a little bit. Make sure I just close out of any errors, give it a save again real quick. You can see we get an object with our description, our duration in minutes is active, and name. And if I were to change this information, click save again, you can see I get that updated information inside of here. So now all I need to do is call the action that we want to create. So here, instead of just console logging it, I want to create something on our database. So what we can do is close down all of these different folders. I'm going to create a brand new folder called server. And this is where I'm going to put code that should only ever run on the server. And inside of here, I'm going to put a folder for actions. And then inside this actions folder, I'm going to create a file called events.ts. So inside of here, we can make sure that this says use server at the top, since this is server only code. And also I'm going to import a library called use server. And we're going to make sure that we install that use server. And all this library does is it throws an error if this code ever ends up anywhere that's not on the server. So it's just an extra safety factor in place. And now we can export an async function, because all actions must be asynchronous functions, called create event. Now this action is going to take in all the different values we want, because we can actually use this in our event form. So down here, we can just call create event just like that. This is going to be coming from that actions folder. We can pass it in all the different values, and we can await the return value for this. And let's just make sure that this is an asynchronous function. So now we're just calling this create event, passing in our values. And to make sure our value is the right type, I'm just going to use the exact same type we've been using so far. So this is just that schema coming from event form schema. And let's make sure we import all of our different things. I'm going to call this unsafe data. That's because by default, all the data that comes from the client, we can't trust. We just have to assume it's unsafe. So that's why what we can do with our event form is we can actually call the safe parse function. And we can pass it in our unsafe data. And what that's going to do is return to us some information. First of all, it's going to return to us a success property, just like that. There we go. And it's also going to return to us a data as well as any error messages. We don't really care about the error messages. All we care about is the data. And that's because we're already handling the error messages down here. For example, if I pass in no duration, I already get the error message here. So I don't need to handle the error message on the server. I just need to make sure the data is correct, because if it's not correct, I need to let the user know that it's incorrect, because most likely someone's trying to do something malicious. So here, if success is not true, then I just want to return an error that says true. So I'm just going to say there is some type of error. Let's return that down to the user. If there's no error though, then what I want to do is I want to use my database. I want to insert some data into that event table. Whoops, event table. There we go. And I want to insert values. Let's make sure we pass in an array of all of our different values. Actually not an array, because we're only inserting one value. I just want to take all the data that we're getting from here, as well as the Clerk user ID. And that's going to be our user ID. And again, we can get that from the auth function. So we can say const user ID is equal to auth. And this is actually extra important because now we're verifying that the user is signed in before we call this function. So if our success is not true, or our user ID is equal to null, then we want to return that there was some type of error, because either the user is not signed in, which is obviously not good, or the data they passed up is bad. So now once we run this code, we've inserted our event into the database, and now we can redirect ourselves back to the events page. So we can put in events just like that. I just want to make sure that I properly spell redirect. There we go. And that'll redirect us back to the events page. And And now inside of our event form, if we give this a save, we should hopefully create an event if we actually type this in. So with all this information, if I click save, it should hopefully create that event for us and redirect us back to the page, but it looks like we're getting a bit of an error. To make sure it's not something just to do with caching, I'm just going to refresh this page real quick, enter in all brand new information, and that should hopefully fix any particular errors we have. So we can say that it's going to be a name, some description, click save, and it looks like it may have worked. I'm not 100% sure. One easy way to see if it actually created some data is to go to our events page. We should hopefully see on our events page an event, but right now it still says we don't have any event. So it looks like it didn't actually create this. So let me try this again, type in our description, click save, and there we go. It looks like it actually worked that time. So it must have just been some weird caching stuff because now it says events because we actually have some events on our page. But I want to make sure that our error works and we show the error if there is a problem. So in our event action, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make sure I make our data incorrect. So I'm going to say unsafe data.name is equal to undefined. So that's going to be forcing our data to be incorrect. Actually, let's just make it a empty string because of course it must be a string. So now if I pass up some data, this is all correct on the client side, but when it gets to the server, it's incorrect. So we should be throwing an error back down. So I click save, you notice nothing actually saves, but I don't see the error being passed down. So inside of my event form, I want to make sure that I'm getting the data being passed down just like this. And if my data.error, then I want to show an error. So I can just say form.setError. This is going to be a root level error. So we can say root, and then we can pass in whatever the message for our error is. For example, there was an error saving your event. There we go. Then we can render out that error down here. So right above our very top form field, we can say form.formState. We can get all the errors, and I want to get any root level error. And if we have a root level error, well, then I want to render that out. So we can render out a div that has a class name of text destructive to give us a red text. Let's make it kind of smaller. And then we can render out the form state error for our root. And we want to specifically get the message from it. So now if we give this a save, we should hopefully see there was an error saving your event. And that's because the data being passed into our action is incorrect. Obviously, we're faking that, but of course, that's what that looks like. Now, there will be one slight error that you may notice. If we come in here, let's just change around some information inside of here. Let's make our duration correct, make our event name correct, all that kind of information. Give this a quick refresh. Actually, let's just do it completely from scratch. There we go. Give that a save. You'll notice we get an error. You can see cannot read properties undefined reading error. That's because redirect is essentially a never, and it thinks, TypeScript thinks that this create event can only ever return an error with a Boolean. But in the case that we don't actually run into this use case, it returns absolutely nothing. So we need to tell TypeScript what the actual type is of this, because this is a type that is going to be a promise, and this promise is either going to return an error, which is a Boolean, which is the normal case that this works, or it's going to return absolutely nothing, which is undefined. Now you can see I get inside of here an error because data could be undefined. So let me just put the question mark and that'll fix that and fix this potential error from occurring. So now if I create a new event, type in some information, click save, you can see it created that event properly and redirected me to my event page where we can now go ahead and actually render out what our events are supposed to look like. So let's open up that page real quick. And we'll go to here. And now instead of just rendering out the text events right here, let's render out all of our events. So to render out these events, I'm actually going to put them inside of a grid. That's just the easiest thing to do responsively. So we'll do grid, a gap of 4. For our grid columns, I'm actually going to have some custom columns, which is going to be a repeat, which is autofill. And we're going to say it's going to be a min max where the minimum value of these can be is 400 pixels all the way up to 1 FR. Close that off, close off our div. And inside of this div, all we want to do is just loop through all of our events and we're going to put them inside of a card. So we can come in here. We can say we're going to render out an event card, which is a component I'm going to create in just a second. And we'll put our event ID inside of here. And we'll pass along all the information for our event. Now we can scroll all the way down here. I'm just going to create this function in the exact same file because it's only ever used in one particular place. So we have an event card, which is going to take in an ID, an isActive, a name, a description, duration in minutes, and then finally a Clerk user ID. Make sure I spell minutes properly. There we go. And then we can make sure we give this a type, which is event card props. Now, I'm not going to make you be bored by watching me type out those props, so I'm just going to paste them in here. These are the exact props that come from our Drizzle schema. You could import them from Drizzle, but in my case, I want to hard code what they are, just so that I don't accidentally pass in some wrong information or extra information that I don't need, because this is the bare minimum that this event card actually needs. Now, inside this event card, I want to return a card. Yeah, pretty not surprising there. So we're going to have a card just like that. And then inside the card, we're going to have our card header And inside of there, we're going to have our card title. And the card title is just going to be the name of our event. Let me make sure I import our card here. And we're also going to have our card description. And the card description is just going to be how long this is going to be. So I want to format this. So we're going to say format event description. And that's because if it's like 372 minutes, I want to format that in hours and minutes. So we're going to pass in our duration in minutes, and then we're going to create this handy little format function. But this is a function I'm probably going to use multiple places. So I'm going to put that inside of a lib folder, which I already have here. I'm going to create a formatters file. So we'll come in here, we'll export a function with that exact name, which takes in a duration in minutes, and it's going to be a number. Now I'm going to paste in what this function does and then explain the code in depth. So the very first thing we do is we get how many hours are in our duration. So our duration in minutes divided by 60 is going to give us the number of hours. Then we use the modulo operator to get the number of minutes remaining after we subtract out the number of hours. So essentially we just divide our number by 60 and whatever's left over is going to be our minutes. Then this minute string is just taking my minutes, and if we have more than 1 minute, it says MINS, otherwise it says MIN. Same thing with hours. If we have more than one, we add an S to the end. And then finally, if our hours is equal to 0, we return just the minutes portion. If our minutes is equal to 0, we return just the hours portion. And if we have greater than 0 for both of them, we just return the hours and concatenate it with the minutes. So this is just a nice little handy formatter that we can use. And if we give this a quick import just like that, give our actual file a save, you can now see each of these say 30 minutes. But if I were to come in here and create a brand new event, let's say that this one is going to be quite large, 234 minutes. Give that a save. You can now see it says 3 hours and 54 minutes. It's converted that from minutes to hours and minutes, so it's much easier to read. Now, after our header, we're going to have a description section, but again, our description is optional. So our description, if we have a description, then I'm going to render out the description. So we'll say description is not equal to null. Then I'm going to render out some card content. And inside this card content, I'm just going to put our description. There we go. And then finally, we're going to have our footer, which is going to be all the buttons that we have for this. So we'll say card footer. Make sure I import that. Class name is going to be flex. We're going to put them on the end, and we're going to add a little bit of gap and some margin on the top of auto. The only reason that we have this margin top on auto is just to make sure that if we have a description on one event and not on another, it's going to force our buttons to be at the very bottom of the container. Also, to make sure that margin top auto works, I need to add a class name here of flex and flex column to make sure that it's going to be using that flex margin top of auto. So now you can see we have our descriptions showing up on the ones that do have descriptions. And if we expand this a little bit, you can see if I add something into this footer real quick, that is going to be pushed all the way down to the bottom, even if there's no description. That's what this margin top auto does. If I remove that, you'll notice how this section for my footer is moved upwards. So that's why I have that in there. Now let's bring this back down so it's a little bit more reasonable to work with. And instead here, I'm going to put all of our different buttons. So I'll have a button. Again, this will be an as child button because it's really just going to be a link. So we'll come in here with a link, close that off. And this link is going to be an href that goes to the edit page. So we'll say /events/ whatever our ID is /edit, which is a page we're going to create in just a little bit. And then we have edit right there. Also, I want to have an ability to copy this, so we're going to have another button. It's going to be called the copy event button. This is going to be a component we're going to create somewhere else, and that's because this needs to be a client component. So we're going to pass in a variant, which is outline. We're going to pass in the event ID, which is our ID, and then we're going to pass in the Clerk user ID, which is going to be Clerk user ID. And the reason we're passing all this in is because we need to be able to create a URL that we can use to send to someone else. So let's actually create that component. Again, it's going to be in our components folder, .ts, and this should actually say .tsx, just like that. Export function copy event button. Now this is going to be a client component because we're going to be dealing with the clipboard, and this is going to take in our event ID, our clerk user ID, and then finally all of the normal button props that we're used to. So we can come in here and we can define all the different props this is going to take. It's going to take in our button props, just like normal. So this is going to be all the different props that you normally define on a ShadCN button, but we're going to remove the children option because we want to only be able to pass in our own children. We don't want to be able to pass in children that are different because we're going to define those in our actual button. Then what we're going to do is we're also going to pass in an event ID, which is a string, and we're going to have a clerk user ID, which is a string as well. So if I give that a quick save, you can see we have these button props being combined with these specific string types. So this button props right here is all the different things you can add to a normal ShadCN button. Then we're going to return that normal ShadCN button and pass it in all of our different button props. And we also should probably make sure that we also omit the onClick function as well. There we go, because we're going to define our own onClick that we want to use inside of here. So first of all, before we add that onClick, let's close off our button and render out what we want inside of it. So we essentially want to have some icon. This is going to be a copy icon, and we're actually going to create that as a variable. Copy icon, just like that. And that's because depending on the state of our copy, if we are waiting to copy, if it errored out, if it successfully copied, we're going to render a slightly different copy icon. So I'm going to use a function and pass it in some state that's either going to be success, not success, and so on. So to get that state, let's use a variable. So we have copy state, set copy state equals use state, and this is going to be a copy state variable. So let's come up here and define that type. That's either going to be idle, where it's waiting to be copied, which means we have successfully copied, or error, if we had an error copying out this information. And by default, we're going to be in the idle state. Now this function for get copy icon, all it's going to do is take in that copy state, which is a copy state variable, and it's going to return to us what this should be. So I'm just going to throw in a quick switch statement here, make sure I close this off properly, and all I'm going to do is import these icons, which come from the Lucid React library, again, part of ShadCN. So we have the normal copy icon, the copy with a check mark, and the copy with an X inside of it, so we can see exactly what those different states look like. So now we're rendering out our copy icon. All we want to do is make sure we give it a specific size. So we'll say class name is size 4, and the margin on the right is going to be 2. And that's because we're going to put some text inside of here, which is going to be our actual children. So we're going to call get children, pass it in our copy state. Because again, if we have an error, if it was successful, and so on, we want to be able to have different text inside of here. And I'm just going to copy this function over because it's relatively straightforward. In the idle state, we say copy link. If we successfully copied, it says copied. And if there's an error, it says error. So now it's just going to give us the proper information directly inside of here. Now, the last thing we have to do is set up our onClick to actually work with the clipboard. And this is relatively easy to do. There's a navigator.clipboard property that we can use, and we can add the write text property. All this does is allows us to write specific text to the user's clipboard. So we can come in here, and the text that we want to write is going to be at our location origin. That's going to be our particular URL. Then we want to add in the URL for actually booking an event. So that's /book/Clerk user ID / and then we want to add in the event ID as well, event ID. There we go. Now this is not a page that we've created yet, but essentially this is going to be the URL for what we do for creating a booking. So if we really want to, we could create that right now in our public folder. We could create something called book, and then inside there we could create a brand new folder, and that's going to be Clerk user ID. And then for that, we can create another folder called event ID. There we go. And then inside of all of that, we can create page.tsx. And that's essentially what this is going to lead to. I can export this as a default function. We can call this whatever we want, book event page. And I can just return an H1 that says, hi. This is where it should redirect us to if we're trying to book an event for a particular user. I'm going to come in here, make sure I import that copy button, and then let's finish off the rest of our information for our copy to handle all the different states, because this is just a promise. So this is going to return to us a .then. So if things were successfully copied, well, I'm going to set my copy state to copied, and then I'm going to set a timeout, and this timeout is just going to essentially say set copy state back to idle after 2 seconds. There we go. And then I can copy this down and do this for a .catch. In the case that we had an error, I'm going to add the error state, and then after 2 seconds, move it back to the idle state. So now if I click on copy link, you can see it says copied, and then after 2 seconds, it's going to go away. And it copied a link to my clipboard that if I paste into my URL, it's going to bring me to that page that says hi directly on it. So it allows us to go to the specific page for that event for that particular user. That's all this button is doing for us, and the only reason we brought it into its own component is because we needed that use client at the top of the file. Now the final thing that I need to do for this particular event page, if we just go back to that event page, is I want to make sure that if we have an inactive event, I'll just call this one inactive, and we'll come in here, toggle that off. I want to make sure that this shows up as inactive. I shouldn't be able to copy the link. It should be more easily denoted that this is inactive. So first of all, what I can do here is for my copy button, I can render this only if my thing is active. So if it's active, then render out the copy button. So now you can see this copy button doesn't show up for my inactive one. That's already a great start. The next thing that I can do for this is I can come back over to here for my card. On the class name, I can just essentially make it slightly opaque. So what I can do is I can use that CN class, pass it in, all my information, CN, make sure that I import that CN function. There we go. Pass it in my default styles here. And then in the case that we are not active, what I want to do is add a class of border secondary, but I want it to be 50% opaque. So my border is a little bit harder to see. There we go, give that a save. You can now see that the border around this is a little bit more faded. Also, I'm going to make it so that most of my text is also partially opaque. So in my header here, I'm going to add a class name. That's CN. Again, if we are not active, then I want to add an opacity of 50%. So my text is going to be 50% opacity. And then I'm going to do the exact same thing with the content here. Paste that in. So now if there's a description, again, that's also going to be 50% opaque. So now you can see this inactive one is very much inactive. The only thing that's not opaque is the button, and that's because I want to make sure people know that this button is still clickable so that I go ahead and actually edit this if I need to. So now that we have the entire list view done, we can move on to making the edit button actually work, because right now it doesn't do anything. So let's create a brand new folder inside of here for our individual event IDs, and then inside of that folder, we need to have an edit folder. And then finally, I'll just copy over my new page into here, and I'm going to change this to edit event page, just like that. And obviously I need to make some changes into what this is look like. So for example, this will say edit event, just like that. So now at least if I click on this edit event page, it brings me to a completely blank form. Obviously I should pass in some default values for my form. So I want to get my user. So first thing first, I can get my user ID and the redirect to sign in function and get that from my auth right here. There we go. Make sure I import that. And then I can just say, hey, you know what? If my user ID is equal to null, then I want to redirect myself to the sign-in page. And let's just return that. There we go. The next thing I can do is actually get my event. So I can say const event is equal to awaiting calling my database. Again, I could do a query on my event table. This time I only want to find the first one. I want to find the first one where I have specific things being set to true. So I'm going to just put some parentheses in there. Close that off. There we go. So I want to get it where my ID is a specific ID and my Clerk user ID is a specific ID. So for my checks, I need and equals. So I can do an and check here. There we go. And I want to make sure my Clerk user ID is equal to my ID. And then finally, and actually that's user ID. There we go. And then the next thing I want to do is I want to check to make sure my event ID, which is just ID, is equal to my event ID, which actually comes from my parameters. So up here, I have some parameters that are coming in, and that's because I gave this a square bracket event ID. That allows me to take in dynamic parameters with the same name. So we have an event ID, and we just need to give this a TypeScript type. Make sure I put that in the right spot. So this is params. There we go, which takes in an event ID, which is a string. Give that a quick save. Make sure that this is an asynchronous function. And now we should be getting our event, and we can actually pass that down into here. So we can say our event is equal to our event just like that. But of course, for our event form, we're not taking in any params. So I want to be able to take in an event, which is going to be an optional parameter. So we can say event. This is going to be an event, which is an optional parameter, which is going to contain a bunch of different fields inside of it. So for my form, the things that I need is I need the ID for being able to update it. I need the name, which is going to be a string. I need the description, which is going to be an optional string. There we go. I also need the duration in minutes, which is going to be a number. And then finally is active, which is a Boolean. All of this information I can pass in as my default value. So I can come in here and say event, or I can use whatever this is. So if my event is not true, I can even use this nullist coalition kind of thing. So if I don't have an event, it'll use this as my default. Otherwise, it'll use my current event parameters. Now, if I give that a save and I refresh this page, it should hopefully pre-populate with all of the default information for my event, which is great. Now I am getting an error over here. And if I look at the error, essentially the reason this error is showing up is because description right here inside of Drizzle is set to string or null, and I have it set to be undefined here. So the easiest way for me to fix that is just to create a brand new object and to change my description here to be either event.description or null. And actually instead of null, this should be undefined. There we go. So essentially I'm just replacing my event description with undefined in the case that it should be undefined. Also, I shouldn't need this question mark here because if I don't find an event, for example, if my event is equal to null, I should return a not found error, just like that. So that cleans up all the different errors that I have, And again, if I give this a refresh, everything populates great. Now all I need to do is make it so that instead of creating a brand new event, it actually updates the existing event I have, because my event form, all it does right now is create events. So inside of here, I need to get whatever my current action should be. And that's going to depend on if I have an event or not. So if my event is equal to null, then I'm going to call create event. That's pretty self-explanatory. Otherwise, I'm going to call a function called update event, which I haven't created yet. And down here is where I'm going to pass in all the information for my action. So let's go back into our actions folder. I'm going to copy everything for creating the event, because updating it is going to be relatively straightforward. The only difference is I'm also going to take in an ID, which is a string, as my very first parameter. And then I'm going to take in all of my unsafe data. Again, I'm going to make sure I have a user, which is correct. I'm going to make sure all my data is correct. And if any of those are incorrect, I pass down an error. Then what I'm going to do is try to update my particular user. So I can say await db.update, and I want to do an update on my event table. I want to set specific data, which is just all of the data that I'm going to be getting in. And I want to do this where some specific fields are true. So I'm going to use an AND query, and I'm going to use an equal query here. So I'm going to check my event table.id is equal to the ID that's being passed in. And then also, I want to check to make sure that my user ID is also correct. So event table.clerk user ID is equal to my user ID, because obviously I don't want people to update events that they didn't create themselves. So now this is me creating an event, or I'm sorry, updating an event. And to check to see how many events were updated, I can use this row count variable right here. And I can get that directly from waiting for this. And if my row count is equal to 0, well, that means that there was no event to update. Either the ID was incorrect, or the user ID was incorrect, or something went wrong. So I'm just going to return that there was an error down to the user. Otherwise, redirect them back to the events. So now I have update event and I have create event. So inside of here, I can import my update event. But again, this update event takes an ID as the first parameter. So we can say bind null and then pass it in our ID, just like that, which is event.id. And that'll actually make sure it binds the first parameter to be our ID. That way we always pass in the value of the second parameter. So now this should hopefully update this. So if I just come in here, I'll refresh just to be sure that everything's completely up to date. And we'll say this is the updated name. We'll do 60 minutes right here, and we'll add a description. Click save for this. And you can see now it says inactive updated. It's 1 hour and it has a description. And if I change it to active and save, you can see that it has updated properly. So now really the last thing I want to do is add in a simple delete button here to delete anything. So the very bottom here where I have all my different buttons, I want to add in a brand new button where if I have an event, then I want to be able to add in this ability to delete this event. I'm also going to make sure that there's a pop-up that comes up that says, are you sure that you want to delete this? Just in case they accidentally click that button, by accident. So I'm going to use the alert dialog directly from our components here. So we have an alert dialog, and then we need to have an alert dialog trigger, just like that. And this trigger is just whatever button we want to use. So I'll say as child, and I'll pass it in a button. Now this button, I'm going to actually create our own custom variant, which is called destructive ghost, just like that. So we're going to create that in just a second, because right now it doesn't exist by default, but inside this button, it's going to say delete. Also, I'm going to make sure that this button is disabled anytime that we are submitting our form. So if the form.formState.is submitting is true, submitting, there we go. If we're currently submitting our form, do not actually let us interact with this button. And also, if is delete pending is true, then we want to make sure that this is also not interactable. So we can create that state variable all the way at the top here. We'll kind of minimize down a lot of this stuff. All the way at the very top, we'll say is delete pending, and set is delete pending equals use state. There we go, just like that. And I think we're eventually going to convert this away from a state variable, but for now, we just have it in place so we at least get rid of all the different errors for our button. Now let's go ahead and actually work on creating this variant, because right now we don't have a variant for that. So right below here, I'm just going to paste in the code for this. Essentially, all we're doing is we're taking this text destructive. We're making it so that when we hover over it, we turn it into a dark background that's red. And then also when we hover over it, we change the background or the text color to be a white color that goes over top of it. That's literally all that's going on. I'm just going to put this onto one line so it's a little bit easier to read. There we go. I guess it's not going to go on one line because it's a little bit too long. But now you can see this button. If we look over here, when we hover it, it turns red. And when we don't, it has red text. It's just a new variant we can add. And this just shows how easy ShadCN is to customize. So now that we have the trigger done, we need to add the content for our alert. So we're going to have alert content. And this is alert dialog content. There we go. And inside of here, we need a header. So we have our alert dialog header. And inside the header, it can say something like, are you sure? There we go. And then we need to have a description inside of here, which is essentially what the alert dialog is doing. Alert dialog description. And this one just says this. I'll just copy it over. You probably don't want to watch me type that out. There we go. This action cannot be undone. This will permanently delete your event. Again, making sure that they know what's going to happen. So now we have that header. And of course, the description should be inside this header. There we go. And this should be inside of a title, just like we have with the actual cards. We need this inside of an alert dialog title. Dialog title. There we go. Get that at the end, just like that. And I believe I imported my dialog title from the wrong location. Yes, I did. I make sure I import that from the UI components, not the radix library. Back down to here. We have our title, we have our description. Finally, outside the header, we can put in our footer because we don't really need any other content. So alert dialog footer. And inside of here, we're going to have a cancel button. Alert dialog cancel. And this cancel button is just going to say cancel, super straightforward. And then finally, alert dialog, and this one's going to be our action. And this is the thing that allows us to actually do anything inside of here. So again, we want to make sure this is disabled. If we're currently deleting or doing any other type of submitting, just make sure we don't have any way to interact with this particular button. And inside of here, we just want to say delete. And then finally, we can add in what we want to do whenever we click on it. And in this case, we want to actually start a transition. So where I had that state variable, instead of using a state variable, I want to use transition. And this just allows us to really easily call essentially a function on our server and wait for that to happen on our client. So this is going to be called start delete transition. Make sure I spell everything properly. So now anytime I want to be able to wait for something that's happening on the server, I can just call that function. So inside of here, I can call that start delete transition. This is going to take an async function inside of it because again, it's going to be calling some code on our client or on our server, I'm sorry. And it's going to call a delete event function, which takes in our event ID and we'll get back some data from that. There we go. And if we have some type of error, I'm just going to make sure that we render that to the user. So here, if we have an error, then I want to just show that to the user. And that should be all that we need to do inside of this. Let's just make sure that this button has a variant of destructive. There we go. Now you will notice by default, there's no variant on this. So again, let's modify what our actual ShadCN component looks like. All we need to do is we need to add in a variant prop, just like that. And we can pass that into here as our variant. And to get the type for this variant prop, what we can do is after this, we can say that we want to concatenate this type with our own type, which is just going to be a variant, which is optional. And it's going to use the variant props from our button here. So we can say variant props type of button variants. And we want to specifically get, if I close that off there, we specifically want to get the variant property from that. And that's because this allows us to pass in things like, if we hover over this, we have destructive, destructive ghost, outline, secondary, so on. So this just allows us to customize what our button actually looks like. So we're just adding that into our ShadCN. That gets rid of any errors we have with that. All we have left to do is to create this delete event function, which should be relatively easy. We just need to do it inside of that server action for our event right here. So I'm going to take our update and just copy it down completely because we're going to have a lot of very big similarities between the two. This is going to say delete. There's no unsaved data being passed in, so we don't have to worry about any of our data information. But of course, we want to make sure that we have the correct user ID. So of course, we're going to put our user ID check inside of there. Then here, instead of doing an update, we're going to do a delete, which means we don't need to set any information. But we want the same where clause, only delete if it's the user ID and the particular ID, and then make sure an actual delete happened. Now with all that information done, we should be able to actually click this delete button, and it should delete this. So let's do a refresh just to make sure everything's hooked up properly. In here, I want to make sure that I import this. And then once I have that done, again, I'm going to do a refresh, give this all a save. And now let's click the delete button. Are you sure you want to delete this? This is that pop-up that we created. I'll click delete. And you can see that now we no longer have that event inside of here, so it has properly been deleted. Now, the very last thing that I want to do now that we have pretty much everything done on this page is I want to go back to where that particular page was. And all I want to do at the very top of that page is export a const called revalidate. Set that equal to 0 just to make sure that there's absolutely no caching that occurs on this page because I always want it to give me the most up-to-date events that are happening. I'm also going to do the exact same thing on my edit page. I again want to make sure that this always has the most up-to-date information on it. So we're going to make sure our revalidate is set to 0 here as well. Now that's everything taken care of for creating, copying, editing, deleting events. The next thing I'm going to work on is our schedule page, which I know it seems like we spent a lot of time just on events, but we've really laid the groundwork for a lot of other stuff we're going to do, which is going to make certain things a lot easier. For example, our schedule is going to go much quicker. So let's create a page.tsx. I'm just going to copy over what we have on the events page for now. And actually, I'm going to copy over what I have on the new event page. And that's just because essentially this schedule page is just going to be one giant form. So we'll call this our schedule page. And obviously, instead of an event form, we're going to render something else out. So we'll just say whatever we want inside of here. So inside of our schedule page, we want to make sure that our title here is schedule. There we go. And we also want to get what our schedule is. And of course, we want to get the user ID because every user has exactly one schedule. So we'll say user ID and redirect to sign in is going to be coming from that auth function. And again, if our user ID equals null, then we can return redirect to sign in. There we go. And now we can get our schedule, which is coming from awaiting. Make sure I put equals there. Make sure that this is an async function. And all we want to do is await db.query, and this time we're going to query on the schedule table. I want to find the very first schedule, just like that. And I want to do a simple where clause. There we go. So we're going to have inside of here our clerk, user ID, and the equals function. And we're just going to make sure that those are equal to each other. So clerk, user ID, and the actual user ID. So we're getting the schedule for that particular information. And I also want to get all of the availabilities. So we're going to say with availabilities ordered by their start time. So we can say start time is going to be in descending order. And we can just say that we want to, make sure that's a function, get the descending order. We need a parentheses right there. And another one all the way back here. There we go. That'll clean that up. So now I can actually call that descending function and pass it in my start time. There we go. So now that should hopefully order everything for us and get us back our schedule. So we can pass that information into our schedule form. So here, let's create a schedule form and pass it in our schedule, just like that. Now to do our schedule form, I'm going to actually just copy our event form and I'm just going to rename it to schedule form. There we go. And now inside of here, schedule form. And then finally up here, make sure we get our schedule form. Now, obviously, we're going to have a bunch of errors because this is currently rendering our event information, and we want to make sure we render our schedule information. So let's go ahead and clean that up. First of all, we want to pass in a schedule here. And this schedule is going to be something that's optional because by default, when you first create your account, you don't have a schedule set up. So it's going to be optional. And all it's going to have is a time zone, which is a string, and an array of all the availabilities. So we have our availabilities, and that's going to be an availability array. There we go. And let's create that type. So we'll just copy this up, availability. And all this is going to be is a start time, which is a string, an end time, which again is a string, and then finally a day of week. And this day of week is a little bit more complicated because we want to get that from the days of week in order. So we can say type of days of week in order. And all I want to do is just get all the different values from this. So I can say number like this, and that's going to convert this into essentially a list of all the different values from that array. And that only works because we made this an as const value. So now that we have that, we have all the information for our schedule. None of this other stuff matters. We don't really care about anything else. Now, when it comes to our form, we can move on to this. This is actually going to use our schedule form schema, just like that. And I'm actually going to go ahead and create this. So let's put that down in all the places where we have our event form schema. Up here where we have that, we can just remove that import completely. There we go. So now let's go ahead and create that schedule form schema. So inside of our schemas folder, we can create one called schedule.ts, and we can export a constant variable of that, which is going to be from Zod, and it's going to be an object. Now the schema is going to be a little bit complicated here. The very first thing we have is actually easy. It's a time zone. So it's going to be a string, and it's going to be a minimum of 1 with the text required. That part is relatively straightforward. The complicated part is going to be our availabilities. This is going to be an array, so we can say z.array, and it's going to be an array of objects. So z.object, and the objects are going to have a day of week. This one's also pretty easy. It's just going to be an enum, which is going to be one of our days of weeks in order. So that's not too difficult. And let's make sure we have a comma here so everything's working properly. The next thing after we have our day of week is we need to have a start time. And this is where it gets a little bit complicated. This is going to be a string, but we need to make sure it conforms to a particular regular expression. So we can say regex like this, and I'm going to copy over the regular expression and then tell you exactly what it does. So we'll paste that in like that, make my screen a little bit bigger so it all fits on one line. And essentially this regular expression is broken into two distinct parts. You can see this colon right here. We have a section after the colon and we have a section before the colon. Now this is going to denote time that's in the format of like 0, 1, and then some, hour amount, or it could be like 14, 20, something like that. So this second half is just going to be any number between 0 and 59. That's why we have the first number being 0 to 5 and the second number being 0 to 9. So that's anywhere between 0, 0 to 5, 9. Then in this next section, we have 3 distinct sections we need to worry about, actually 4 distinct sections. The very first is if you pass in just one single number, it must be 0 to 9. So I can pass in 112 like this, and it's going to work. The second option is when you pass a 0 at the start. For example, when I had 0, 1, 12. This allows you to pass a 0 and then any number 1 to 9. Now, if I have a 1 at the beginning, I also can pass in a 1 or any value between 0 to 9. And then finally, if I put a 2 at the beginning, I can only pass in 0, 1, 2, 3. So this just says any value between 0 and 3 is going to work fine for the value of 2. Now, the final thing I want to do on this regular expression is add just an error format that just says time must be in the format HHMM so people kind of know what to expect. Now I'm going to remove that information down there, copy this entire thing because the end time is exactly the same. So we'll say end time, and again, it's exactly the same, just a different name. Now, unfortunately, it still gets even more confusing than this, and that's because we need to actually refine this even further. So where we have our array being finished right here, I want to call the super refine function. And what this allows me to do is to add errors if certain conditions are not met. For example, I don't want to have any start or end times that overlap with each other, and I also want to make sure the end time is always after the start time. So this is going to give me all of my availabilities, and it's also going to give me some context information. So we'll say ctx to get all that information. And inside of here, all I want to do is take my availabilities. I want to loop through each one of them. That's going to give me an availability and an index number, which I can use to actually add errors to my form if I need to. So just like that, I can come in here and I can determine if they overlap. So overlap is going to be if my availabilities have any availability that is overlapping. So A and I. So what I want to do is I want to determine if the particular availability I am on overlaps with any of my other availabilities. So all I want to do is return if the I in here is not equal to my current index, because obviously if the availability is the same one I'm looping over, ignore it. So this just says ignore the current availability. Then I want to check to see if the day of week is the same as my availability dot day of week. So this is saying, are they both on the same day? If they're not on the same day, obviously they don't have to worry about overlap. Then the next thing I want to do is compare the start and end times of these. So of course I need to be able to convert my string into some kind of easy to evaluate number. So I'm going to create a function called time2int that's going to convert these things for me. Now I'll just paste in the function. It's really easy. All I do is replace a colon with a period and then convert that to a float. That's going to essentially convert something like 2352 or like that to the number 23.52. So obviously any number that is larger on the time scale is going to be a larger number, which makes it really easy for us to do these conversions. So now we have our overlap. I can check if the time2int for my a.start time, if this for some reason is less than my time2int of my availabilities, availability.end time, and the exact same thing, time2int of the end time is greater than the time2int of the start time of the other availability, then I have an overlap. So I'm going to go through exactly what this means in a little bit more depth so it's easier to understand. Let me just clean up my parentheses. So first of all, if the indexes are the same, it means it's the exact same availability. So obviously they can't overlap with each other because they're the same exact thing. Secondly, we're checking, are the days of week the same? Because if they're not the same, for example, if one's on Monday and one's on Tuesday, obviously they can't overlap. Then finally, we're checking, okay, does the availability that I'm checking, is the end time for my current availability after the start time for another availability? And is the start time for this availability before the end time of the other availability? Essentially, all this means is if these two availabilities overlap each other in any way, it's going to throw me an error. Essentially, this is going to be true right here. Now, if they do overlap, so if overlaps is true, then I want to add an error. So we can say ctx.add issue, and we want to add an issue that has a code of custom, because this is going to be a custom error. We want to add a message, and this message just is going to say right here, I'll just copy it over, the availability overlaps with another. And then the path is going to specify where that actually shows up. So we're saying the path for this is going to be at availabilities index. So whichever availability we're looping through, we're going to throw the error on that individual availability in our array. And this path is just used for rendering out our error messages. Now we also have one more error we want to check for. I'm just going to copy this one in. Essentially, we're just checking to see if the start time is always after the end time, because if the start time is after the end time, obviously we have an error. The end time must be after the start time. So we just have another error that we're throwing. So that's what this whole super refined thing does. It's checking for overlap, and it's checking to make sure the end time and the start time are in the correct order. Now I'm actually going to take this time to int, and I'm going to move that into its own file. So inside of my lib, I'm just going to have a little helper here. And we might as well just put it in the utils here. So we can just say time to int is just going to be right there. Let's export that. There we go. So now we have that function. And now we can make sure we import it into here, because we're probably going to have to use this in other locations. So now what we can do is we can work on our schedule form. So we have our schema. Let's import that to see if that fixes some of our errors. And of course, our default values need to change. So this is going to be based on our schedule. So first of all, we're going to have our time zone. And this time zone is just going to be our schedule.timezone if it exists. Or we're going to get the current user's time zone, which is intl.datetimeformat.resolvedoptions.timezone. That's just going to give you whatever the current time zone you are in. Then we want to get all of our availabilities. So our availabilities here is schedule.availabilities, and we want to sort these. So we'll say toSorted. This is going to give us an A and a B, just like that. And then what we want to do is just return the time to int of a.startTime, and we want to subtract that from our time to int of b.startTime. And this is going to sort them in order with the earliest start time first and the latest start time last. Now also, something that we don't really need to do is we don't need to do our sorting up here. So where we're doing all this ordering, we can actually remove that just because it's not going to really order in the way that we want it to. So let me just clean this up a little bit. There we go. Get rid of the ordering there, and we're just going to do the ordering right here. So now we can move on to actually creating the form itself. I'm going to skip over this on submit section for now. We can come back and finish that when we actually get our form filled out, because then we'll know what data to pass to that form. So we got all the handling of everything. We got our error message showing up fine. Inside of here, the very first thing we're going to want to do is the time zone, because that's going to be relatively simple. But instead of a normal input, we're actually going to want to use a select field so they can just select their time zone from a list of all the available time zones. So we're going to need to install from ShadCN the thing that we need. So we can say ShadCN, and we want to add the select component. So we'll just get that installed real quick. There we go. And after that actually finishes installing, we can just go ahead, rerun our application so we have it all going. So now this is going to say time zone. There we go. Then instead of this input, we want to have a select. And this select is going to be quite a bit more complicated than an input, because we obviously need to pass it all the different options. So let's have our select like there. Make sure we import this from our library. And then inside of here is where we actually need to put our form control. So let's move the form control inside the select. And then inside of here, we're going to have our select trigger. This is the thing that we click on to open our select box. So we'll have a select trigger. And inside the select trigger, all we're going to do is put the select value. And this is just going to print out whatever the current value is. I want to make sure I import that from the correct location, because I believe I imported it from the wrong one. So let's just make sure we move that up into there. There we go. Now, hopefully we get that quick save, that'll all format. So this will give us the actual value of our select. And to hook that up, we can have an onValue change here, which is just field.onChange. And then we can have a default value, which is just going to be set to our field.value. There we go. So now we actually have our select clickable. Now we just need to make sure we can open up the select. So the next thing is the select content, just like this. Inside of our select content, we want to loop through all the available time zones. So we can say intl.supported values of, and we can say time zone, and this is going to give us all the different time zones. So let's just map through each time zone, just like this. And for each one, we want to return the select item. There we go. Let's make sure we import that. Same thing with select content. I believe we want to make sure we import that. We can specify the key here, which is just our time zone. And we also want to specify a value, which is our time zone itself. And then finally, inside of here, we can render out the text of our time zone, just like that. And I also want to show them what the time zone offset is, because a lot of times when you're looking at time zones, you don't know exactly what your time zone is unless you look at the offset. So here, we can just add in the time zone offset. So we can create a function called format time zone offset, pass it in the time zone just like that. And now we can go ahead and add this into our formatter function. So if we look down here, we have our formatter, export function. This is going to take in a time zone, which is a string. And then all we need to do is take an intl.datetime format, pass an undefined as the actual format. That way it uses the current user's locale. And then we say that we want the time zone to be the time zone we're passing in. And then we want to get the time zone name as a short offset. That's how we want to display this to the user. Then we can call format to parts, and that's going to essentially give us a bunch of different information. We can format it on whatever date we want, doesn't really matter. And now what we can do is we can find the parts. So we can say for each part, we want to get it where the part.type is equal to time zone, zone name, just like that. And now we can make sure we get the value of that. All this is going to do is just give us this time zone name portion from the formatter. So it should say like -4 + 2, depending on what the time zone offset is. So now if we come back into our form, we should be able to actually render that out. There we go. And now we should hopefully get rid of all the errors through there. So to see if this is working properly, let's just scroll down a ways and get rid of most of these other form inputs because we're not going to actually need them. So we'll get rid of all of those. Down here, we can get rid of this delete button because there is going to be no delete button. And also looking at this bottom section, I realized we don't have any loading state on our buttons from our event form. So let's make sure we add those in there. All we can do is just right here, we have this disabled. I want to add this to each one of our different buttons. So I'm going to copy this, add it to our button. Actually, there we go. We'll add it to the cancel button and the normal button. There we go. So now we have these both being disabled if we're currently submitting. Now, if we go back to the schedule form, we don't even need to worry about any cancel button because we have no ability to cancel. But we do want to make sure we disable this if the form is submitting form.formStatus.is submitting. There we go. So now we should be able to give that a quick save. Looks like we might have some errors still. Let me just make sure our form is restarted, which it is. Give our page a refresh, see if it cleans up any of the errors that we had. Get rid of some of the stuff that we no longer need imported anymore. There we go. It does look like our page is rendering, which is great. And you can see we have our time zone selector with all of our different time zone offsets. Looks like the spacing is not quite ideal, so we maybe want to add an additional space into there. So let's just come in here at the start, add a space there, and that just spaces those out from each other, which is nice. Then when we refresh, it uses the current time zone, which that's my time zone, so it's correctly using that time zone. And we can get rid of the form description because we don't actually need that. So now that we have our time zone done, we can minimize that. And I want to go ahead and work on all of our different scheduled sections because really the last thing we have left is our availabilities. That's the only thing left. And this is going to be a little bit unique. So I'm going to use a grid layout for this. So we'll say class name grid columns. And the reason I'm using a grid layout is because I want to have the text like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday on one side. And on the other side, I want to have all the different time slots. That way we don't have any weird jagged moving around. It's just going to be, everything is going to line up at a super nice grid. So our columns are going to be auto and 1FR. That's just going to make the left side, which is going to say Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, as small as possible, and everything else will fill all the space available. Then we're going to have a gap in the Y direction of 6 and a gap in the X direction of 4, just to space things out. And the reason we're making the vertical direction more is because that's the direction separating like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and so on. Now inside of here, I want to loop over all my days of the week in order, and this is just going to give me like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and so on. And if I wanted, I could just render this out in a div that says day of week. Give that a quick save. And now you can see it says Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday across the different columns because I have a 2-column layout. So it's showing them across the 2 columns. Now, obviously, I want to render 2 separate things in here so the names go on the left and everything else goes on the right. So to do that, we're going to use a fragment just like that. And the reason I'm using the full name fragment is because I need to specify a key on it, which is going to be the day of the week. Now inside that fragment, I can have a div that is the day of the week, and then I can have another div, which is just going to be whatever my content is. So now you can see on the left, I have all the days of the week, and on the right, I have all my content information, and it's purposely separating them, which is exactly what I want. Now the next thing that I want to do is just add some simple class names on here. So for this one, I'm going to make it so it's capitalized. The text is going to be small, and the font is going to be semi-bold. And for this day of week, all I want to do is just get the first 3 letters. So I'll say substring, and I want to go from 0 to 3. There we go. So now you can see it says Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. That's great. Next, I want to worry about focusing all of the different columns of all of my different data, which is going to go inside of here. So this is going to be a flex column. with a gap of 2 between each individual thing in my content section. And this div section is just going to be for rendering out the button to start with. So we're going to have a button inside of here, and this button is going to be for adding new information. So we'll say type is equal to button. On click, we're going to do something. We don't know what it is yet, so we'll just add the on click, but that's going to be for adding a new availability. We'll keep that blank for now. And inside of here, I just want to add the plus icon. There we go. And let's make it so that the size is equal to full. Make that a class name. That way it fills the entire space that it is given. There we go, size of full. You can see that we have that massive button showing up. Obviously, we want to make it look a little bit nicer than that, so we'll add in some extra things on here. For example, we'll change the size of our button to be a size of 6 with a padding of 1, and the variant here is going to be outline. So now we just have that nice plus button, and I can click on that, and that will run this function, which will add an availability, but we're not quite to that point yet. So in order to deal with these arrays of data that we can dynamically add and remove from, we have a really handy function that we can use, which is called useFieldArray. This comes from React Hook Form, and all we need to do is pass it the name of the thing that we're using as an array, which in our case is our availability. We also need to pass it in the control. So we'll say control, which is form.control. And then here we have our availability. And as you can see, it's just right there, availabilities. We even have type safety and everything. And this will give us a bunch of different information. The most important things is it gives us an append, a remove, and a fields option. So fields is all the different fields. Remove allows us to remove a field, and append allows us to add a field. So I'll call this add availability. I will call remove availability. And then finally fields, I'll call availability fields, just so we know that this is distinctly related to our availabilities. And this was remove availability. There we go. So now that we got all that cleaned up, the next thing I want to do is I want to group each of my availabilities by the day of week. So we can say grouped availability fields is object.groupBy, which is a super handy function that I absolutely am so glad they created. All we need to do is we need to pass it in the array that we want. And what I'm going to do is add the index to the array. You'll see why in a little bit, but I need that for actually deleting things. So we'll add in the index to each one of our values. So all I'm going to do is take my field and add in the index to it. So all this is doing is adding the index to each one of my fields so I can easily remove them. And then finally, I want to group the availability fields by the day of the week. So for each day of the week, that's the same. It's going to group them. And then inside of here, we'll have grouped availability fields for each of the different days, all the way Monday through Sunday, which is super handy. So now down here, we can essentially loop through each of those for each day of the week that we're in. So I can take my grouped availability fields for the particular day of the week that we are on, and I can map through them. And of course, it is possible that it's not going to have any values at all, which is why I have that question mark syntax. And we're going to get a field, and we're going to get a label index. The reason I call this the label index is purely because it's used only for labeling, and when it comes to the actual index that we need, that is coming from field.index, which we added just a little bit ago. That's going to be used for updating and so on. And that's because essentially when you use this use field array, it essentially orders all your availability fields in order, and it uses the number in the index as the number that you use for updating and deleting and so on. It's like essentially the ID of your field. That's why we added that to each one of our fields so we know what they were even after we reordered them in this new grouping. So now down here, we can essentially create our own form fields that do everything. So I'm just going to copy the form field we have up here. It's going to be quite a bit different, but it gives us a starting point. So we have our form field. Very first thing that we need to do is have our control. Sweet, that's done. The next thing is the name, and this is going to be a dynamic name that we create here. So it's going to be our availabilities. Then we want to get it for a particular index. That's where that fancy index property comes along. Think about it as like the ID. And then we want to get the specific start time from it. So if our index is 0, this is going to be availabilities.0.starttime. That's going to be able to get the information we need. Then we need to render out our field down here. Now the important thing to note is this field is separate from this field up here. So we have our field that we're rendering out down here. This is going to be our start time, but really we don't even have a label for this. So I'm going to remove this label, and we also aren't using a select. Instead, we're using a simple input where I'm going to pass in all of my field information. So that's all going to be exactly the same as before. I'm going to change my class name here to be a width of 24. And then here's where that label comes in. I'm going to add an ARIA label, and I specifically want to label it for the day of week. So this is the day of week, so that'll be like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. This will say start time, so like Monday start time, and then I want to have the index. So this is our label index, and we're just going to add 1 because this will start at 0 by default. So this will say, for example, Monday start time 1, Monday start time 2, and so on. So people that are using a screen reader know exactly where they need to be. So let me make sure we have our input imported. There we go. We got that. We got our form control, which we need to make sure we have wrapped this form control. Close that off and put our input inside of there. There we go. And now we should just be able to copy this form field down a second time, but of course this time we need it to be the end time, and here it should be the end time. Otherwise everything should be exactly the same. And now I'm just going to wrap these inside of a div just so we can add some styles to make them look correct. So we'll add a div just like that. There we go. Make sure this is in the correct location. Looks like I forgot to move my div far enough up. There we go. That cleans that up. And we can come in here with some class names. And what I want to do is just want to have a flex with a gap of 2 and items in the center just to space them out from each other. Now, another thing to note is I'm not going to actually have my messages directly on each of these input fields. And that's because of the way that we've actually set up our super refine. If you remember, when we go back into our schema for our schedule, we added the super refine and we added it on the index. We didn't add it to like index start time or anything like that. We added it just onto the index. So instead, I'm going to display my messages in a slightly different location. What I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap this in another div. So this div, again, is just going to be stacking my messages away from my actual thing. So we're going to do a flex of column with a gap of 1. And here's where we're going to specify that key, which is just our field ID. Now we're going to copy down that div again. And in here is where I'm going to render out my form message. But the form message here is going to be a little bit different because I'm actually going to render out my own message content. So this message content that I'm going to have is my form state. I want to get the errors for my availabilities, and I specifically want to get the availability at a specific index, and that index that I want to get at is going to be the field index itself. And then finally, I want to get the root message. So this is going to get the message that I set inside of here. That message right there at the custom path, that is the root path for this entire index. So I want to get this particular error message if there is an error message. Also, I want to get any error messages that are for the start time as well. So this is going to say start time. And I also want to get any error messages that are for the end time as well. And that's just because I want all my error messages to show up underneath of both of my times instead of underneath one or the other. That should make things look a little bit better. So right now we still have nothing showing up on the right side of our screen because we have no times, but I can make it so this plus button actually adds a time. We should see something start to work. So we have that add availability function. All we need to do is give it default values. So the day of the week, well, that's just whatever day of the week we're on. We're going to have an end time and a start time. My start time here is just going to be 9 o'clock. And for the end time, we're just going to set that to 5 o'clock, so 1700. Give that a quick save. And now, hopefully, if I refresh to make sure everything's loaded and I click plus, you can see it's added a brand new time that goes from 9 o'clock to 5 o'clock. If I click again, you can see it adds a brand new time. Same thing here. I can click add times in all of these different locations. So now let's see if we actually get validation if we click the save button. If I click save, you can see immediately these availabilities are overlapping with each other. I would need to change this to be like 1800. And now if I save this, you'll notice instead of that, I get the end time must be after the start time. So now let's change this to 1900 and hopefully that'll get rid of all of our errors. And you can see there's an error saving your event. And that's because all the way up here in our on submit, we're calling all the wrong information. Obviously none of this is going to work. So we'll put schedule inside of here. So this should say there's an error saving your schedule. And now here, instead of creating an event and doing all that, all we need to do is save our schedule. So we'll call a function called save schedule just like that. And now let's go ahead and create that. That's going to be in our server actions. We're going to create a brand new file, which is just schedule.ts. Make sure it says use server at the top. And we're going to import that use server library. And then finally export an async function, which is save schedule. And again, it's going to take in the same values. So these values are just going to be this type right here. So we can come over here, import those values, get it from our schema. And now we can just do all the parsing that we need, pretty much exactly like what we did in our event section. So all the way up here where we were saving our event, we can just copy all of that directly into this brand new action. Again, we're using this auth library function. And then here our event form schema is just going to be our schedule form schema. There we go. And let's call this unsafe data and import Zod. There we go. Now saving our information is going to be a little bit more complex because we actually have two tables we need to save to. We need to save the time zone to the schedule table and all these availabilities to the actual availability table. So to do that, we first want to get our information and split it apart. So we have our availabilities and then we have all of our schedule data. And that's coming from our data. So our schedule data is just our time zone and our availabilities is that array of all that information. So the first thing that we need to do is to actually create our time zone. So we can create a const here. And actually, instead of creating a const, we're just going to await our DB. And we want to do an insert statement because we want to create a brand new schedule. And it's going to be on the schedule table. There we go. We also want to insert specific values, and this values is just going to be all of our schedule data plus the user ID for the current user. Then what we want to do is if there is a conflict, so on conflict, what we want to do is we want to actually update the information for this particular schedule. So if we're trying to insert and there's already data there, then we're going to run whatever is inside of here. So what we want to do is we want to do a target. This is the thing that we check for the conflict on. So if there is already a table or a row in the table with this clerk user ID, instead of creating a new one, instead I want you to update the current one by setting all of the scheduled data. So we can just pass in the scheduled data. So this is either going to insert a brand new user for this particular clerk user ID with this scheduled data, or if we already have one, it's going to update the scheduled data. So this just updates the timestamp for our user. And then I want to make sure I get the ID for this particular thing. So the ID of our schedule table.id. There we go. And we can get that out from here. So that's going to return to us an array of information, and we can destructure that to get just the ID, which we will call schedule ID. So we're getting the ID from the very first piece of information returned from here. Then what we can do is we can essentially delete all of the availabilities that we currently have and then re-add new ones. Because there's no easy way for us to say, okay, this is the availability with ID 7. This is the one with availability ID 9. It's just almost impossible because we have the ability to add things and delete things and so on. So keeping track of which one is which is almost impossible. So it's best just to delete them all and then re-add them all. So I'm going to create something called statements. And this is going to be a statement for all the different things that we're going to add and delete. So the very first thing is that I want to give this a type, which is batch item. And this is going to be batch item specifically for Postgres. There we go. And then I'm going to say that this is an array that has db.delete. And I want to delete my schedule availability table. And I just want to get everything out of there for this particular schedule. So equals, make sure I get that imported, schedule availability table. I want to get the schedule ID, and wherever it is equal to the schedule ID, I want to delete it. So essentially what this does is deletes every single schedule availability for that particular user from the database. Then what I want to do is if we have some availabilities, so if our length is greater than 0, then I want to run code for adding all of those. And the reason I'm putting this into a batch is so that I can run both these commands at the same time. That way, if, for example, we delete everything and then the insert fails, it'll roll back and undelete those things for us. That way we don't get a weird issue where we have half of our data deleted by accident. So this is going to be an insert statement where we insert into that table. And this time I want to insert values, which is going to be an array by looping through all of our different availabilities. So let's map through each one of our availabilities, just like that. And we're going to return an object with all the information we want to add. And really, all I want to do is just take all of the availability information and add in my schedule ID. So that's just going to give us our day of week, start time, end day for each one of our availabilities and try to insert all of them. Then all we need to do is just come in here and say await db.batch, and that's just going to run all the statements we want. So we can pass in our statements, and this is going to run first our delete and then our insert. And as long as both of them pass successfully, everything runs fine. Otherwise, if there's an error, it rolls back everything to the state that we had before. It's just to make sure our database doesn't get out of sync. Also, inside of our schedule form, we should probably add the ability to delete something from there. So let's go back into our schedule form. We can import this new function that we just created that should get rid of the errors that we have inside of here. And then all the way down here, where we have this information for our two form fields. At the bottom, what I want to do is I want to add in a button. This is going to be a type of button. We also want to give it a class name, which is going to be a size of 6, padding of 1, and then finally the variant for this one is going to be that destructive ghost variant that we created. And then finally we can add in an onClick, and this is going to be for removing our availability, and this is going to be our field.index. That's that like unique ID that all of these have. Then inside of here, we can just use the X icon just like that, give that a quick save. And we should hopefully see if we add something, we now have an X icon. And if we click on that, you can see that it completely removes it. I also don't think I need these sizes. We can change this to a size of 6 actually to make it a little bit bigger. There we go. So now it's the right size as this plus button up here. So let's just add a few different things. We're going to add some for these. And then this one, I'm going to add multiple. So we're going to do like 18 to 22. There we go. So now we have Monday, Wednesday, and Friday with different information inside of it. And if I click save and we wait, it looks like everything succeeded. To make sure that everything succeeded, we can add in like a success message so we know that they succeeded instead of just an error message, because right now we only check for errors. So let's just put a little else in here and we'll add a success message, which just says schedule saved with an exclamation point. And all the way up here at the very top, we can add some state for that. So we'll say success message set success message equals use state. This is a string. There we go. And now we can use that success message all the way down here to render this out. So if we have a success message, well, then I just want to render that out. Pretty much exactly the same as what I did here, but obviously render out the success message. And we want to have some green text instead. So we'll say green 500. So now let's just try adding something. We'll just do something simple, click save. And you can see schedule saved. And if I refresh my page, you can see those new schedules that we had are automatically staying in there. If I delete Monday, click save, schedule saved, refresh, you can see Monday's now gone. Kind of the final thing I want to do, just a styling thing. I'm going to add a hyphen in between our two things just to note that it's between 9 and there. So let's just add a few more in. Again, we'll add 2 for this value here. We'll do 18 to 22 and we'll give that a quick save. Make sure we refresh, everything is there. So we have our schedule all working fine. And crazily enough, at this point, let's just close all of our files. If we look over here, we've actually finished all of the private pages we have. There's really only 2 pages. You create a schedule and you create the events that people can schedule during. And as long as it fits within your schedule and within Google Calendar for you, they can schedule the event. So now we can actually work on these public pages. The very first thing that I want to do is to create a brand new file called layout.tsx. Also, in our private schedule, I should probably make sure that it's going to have that revalidate of 0, so it's always the most up-to-date possible. So add in that revalidate of 0 to make sure it's always the most up-to-date. There's nothing being cached for that. Also, something we can do to fix our caching. This is only a problem with Next.js 14. As soon as Next.js 15 comes out, you won't have to do this. But in our next config, there's going to be an experimental feature for stale times. And we want to set the dynamic value to 0. By default, anything that's dynamic is cached for 30 seconds. Don't know why, but they did that in Next.js. They're removing it in Next.js 15, but in Next.js 14, you need to add this to get rid of that default. So now let's go ahead back into that public, create our layout here, export default. You know what, actually, I'm just gonna copy this over. It's the most simple layout possible. As you can see, all we literally have is a container that has some margin on the top and bottom, just to make it so that we have a little bit of spacing. Now, the next thing we can work on, if we go into here, we have our event page, but I actually want to create a page specifically just for an individual user. So in our user folder, I'm going to create a new file called page.tsx. There we go. So we have a page for scheduling an individual event, but we also have a page to view all the events for an individual user. So we can say export default function. We'll call this booking page. And inside of here, we can return null. Doesn't really matter. We can return whatever we want. But we also want to be able to get our params, which is our clerk user ID. And we'll come in here, params, clerk user ID, which is a string. There we go. Now in this page, the very first thing I want to do is to get all of our different events. And this is very similar to what we did over on our event page. So I'm just going to copy the code for getting our events from here, but it's going to be slightly different. So I'll paste that down to get all of our events. We obviously want to make sure this is an asynchronous function. We want to import our database, and we want to make sure we rename this column here to like user ID or whatever. There we go, user ID column. There we go. And that's because we already have something called clerk user ID, so obviously that would conflict. So we're first getting all the events for the particular user, but we also want to make sure that they're active. So we're going to do a quick check here where we're checking to make sure that the field is also active, because we don't want to give them inactive ones. That would not make any sense at all. So is active is equal to true. There we go. So now it's both going to check to make sure that clerk ID is correct and that the thing is set to active. Then we're going to order them by name, just because I find that a little bit easier to work with. So we're going to order them by name just like that. Give that a quick save, and that should get us all of our events. And we could just loop over all of our events if we really wanted, but obviously we need to do more than that. First of all, if the events.length is equal to 0, then something obviously is not correct. So we're just going to return a not found page, because the user shouldn't be here. There's almost no case where they can get to this point where there are no events, because they got shared a link. So if the link doesn't lead to any events, they probably shouldn't be there. Also, we want to get the full name of the particular user, and this can be done through the Clerk API. So we can use the Clerk client API, call the users function on it, and then you just call get user, just like that, pass it in our ID. And that's just going to get all of the information for our user. As you can see, tons of information. All we really care about, though, is getting the full name of our user. Really relatively straightforward. So now we can return everything that we want to do. First of all, I want to give this page a maximum size. So our maximum W is going to be 5XL. And we'll put some margin on the left and right of auto. Then what we can do is we can add in a class name here. This is going to be for the user's name. So we're going to make it quite large, 4XL. We're going to make it even larger on larger screen sizes. And then font is going to be semi-bold, margin on the bottom is 4, and we're going to center that text. And in here, we're just going to render out that full name. There we go. So now let's go ahead and actually look at that page. So we'll go over to our events page real quick. We'll just copy the link for one of these and we'll paste it down. And right now, we just need to make sure that we go back to the page for just the user and not the event. So I'll remove the event ID from the end here and go to just the user page. And you can see it just says the user's name directly at the top of the page for whatever user ID you're on. Next, I'm going to add a little miniature description. All I'm doing is making it slightly muted for the text, adding a little bit of spacing on the bottom and making it so that it's not super wide. If we give that a save, you can see it shows all of my text right here. And the reason I made it not super wide is so on large screen sizes, it doesn't stretch, because obviously if I remove this, you can see it gets really wide, doesn't look super great. So making it a little bit skinnier is exactly what we want. Then finally, what we can do is we can render out all the different events for the user. And this is essentially going to use a very similar thing to what we used inside of our events page. So I'm going to go over to our event page and I'm going to copy what we did for rendering out all of our different events, but we're going to do a slightly modified version of it because we don't need all of the same data. So in here, I can paste down my grid just like that. And our grid is pretty much going to stay the same, but we're going to make them a little bit skinnier because we have less information that we want to display. And then we need to do the event card itself. So I'm going to copy over everything for our event card. And again, it's going to be similar, but we're going to change it enough that I don't want it to be in the same component. So I'm going to create all of these imports for all of our different card related stuff. Let's get all that in there. Make sure we get the event description from our formatter here, or duration, sorry. There we go. We obviously don't need any copy button or anything like that, so we can get rid of that. And then finally, whoops, don't need to go into my settings. We can get the button and we can get the link. Now for this particular thing, we don't really care if it's active or not, so we can completely remove that. And we don't need the Clerk user ID because we pretty much already have that. So I can remove those props directly from here. And we also don't need to worry about styling things for is active. So I can remove all of the active related stylings from this entire thing. There we go. Same thing here. I can get rid of all of this class name for both of those because they are all related to the opacity, which we don't care about. And then finally, for our link, we want to change what this link is going to be. It's going to go to the book page for our Clerk user ID, which we need to make sure we pass in somehow. And then finally, we should just do that on our event. We'll do Clerk user ID, and we can keep that up here. So we technically did need that, mostly just for the linking purposes. And then we can come in here with our event ID, which is just ID. There we go. And this will just say select. So they can select which one they want to book. So now if we come over here, you can see they get a list of all of the different events and how long each of those events are, and they're going to be ordered based on their name. We should probably change the direction that they are ordered in though to be ascending instead of descending. So we'll give that a quick ascending order, and you can see that that is working. Now you will notice capital names are showing up first, so we can probably just run some custom SQL here by saying that we want to run SQL. I believe I can just get that directly from here. There we go. So we can have some SQL that we're going to run. And inside this SQL, all we're going to do is we're going to call the lower function, and we're going to pass it in the name, just like that. And actually, this is a template literal, not an actual function that we call. So there we go. That's going to make sure that we use the lowercase version of the name. And now you can see they're ordered properly from top to bottom. And the nice thing about this page is as I expand it, you can see they just go side to side and then they go back into next to each other. So this is a really great way to have this simple grid, which looks really good. And when I click select on any of these, it'll bring me to that individual page, which we can move on to next. This page was relatively straightforward. Now we're on to probably the most complicated page of the application, but I promise it won't take too terribly long. And that's going to be this page for booking an actual event. So the first thing I want to do for this page is actually just add a loading page. We're going to come in here, loading.tsx, because this page might take a while to load. So we're going to add in a loading screen. All this is doing for our loading screen is it's going to add the text loading and a loading circle directly in the middle of the screen. And this is just an icon we get. And all of this code up here is just for centering it perfectly in the middle of the screen. And that's really it. It's relatively a straightforward component. You've probably created something like this a million times. So now if this takes a long time to load, it'll show us that loading text, but obviously this loads pretty much instantly, so we don't need that loading text. You can see when I click here, it very briefly flashed and then disappeared. So now before we even move on to creating this page, the most important thing we need to do is to be able to interact with Google Calendar. So to do that, we need to first go over to the Google console. If just type in Google console, it's the Google Cloud console. And what you want to do is create a project for our thing. So we'll just create a brand new project, give it whatever project name you want. We'll call it Calendly because that's essentially what we're creating. And then we can come in here and we can create this. Now this is going to go through creating our project. And once it finishes, we can actually select that project to create the API key we need. So click select project. You can see it selected up here. And then we can go to this API and services section. This is going to be where we can get two credentials right here on the left-hand side. And from here is where we go ahead and actually create our API keys. So up here where it says create credentials, we want to create an OAuth client ID. And that's because with Clerk, we're authenticating using OAuth. So this allows us to add in the ability to access the user's calendar. So first you need to configure your consent screen. Essentially, this is going to be an external application that anyone can sign up for. So we're going to click create. And then we need to enter all the information for our application. So this is going to be called Calendly clone. And you want to have your user support email be whatever email this is going to be. And then also down here, you need to have your developer contact email. I'm going to use the exact same email. There we go. And then what we can do is we can click save and continue. Obviously, if you want to do this for real, fill out all the information, but I'm just putting the bare minimum that I need inside of there. Now with that done, we can go ahead and actually create what we need. So first we need to add or remove the scopes that we have access to. And in our case, we want access to the user's email, their profile, and open ID. And then also we want access to the calendar. So we can manually add scopes inside of here. So this particular page right here tells you all the different scopes that you have access to. And in our case, we really only care about having access to their calendar, but we don't need everything about the calendar. We only need the events. So I'm just going to copy this particular URL right here. It's just the googleapis.com/auth/calendar.events. And we can paste that directly into here and click add to table. Now we have all of these different authentication things. We have their email, their profile, and open ID. That's just to essentially get their user information. And then finally, all the stuff to deal with their calendar. We can click update, and if we scroll through, you'll see we have some sensitive scopes and some non-sensitive scopes. Sensitive are just more sensitive information that requires extra steps to verify. Once that's done, we can click save and continue, and then we can add any test users. So if you're using more than just your normal user account and you want to sign in with other accounts, you can add them here, but for our case, we're only using one user account. So we can just save and continue from there. And once all that's done, we essentially have this set up. So we have our OAuth screen done. Now we can move back to the credentials and actually create our OAuth client ID. We can say this is going to be a web application, call the client whatever you want just so you can recognize what it is. And now we need to specify all of the information here, which is actually going to tie directly into Clerk. So we can go over to our Clerk dashboard, and here for our Calendly clone that we are working on, what we want to do is we want to move over to the section for user authentication, and we want to do all of our social connections. So here where we have Google, I want to make sure we use our own custom credentials. So enabling this gives us what we need for our client ID, our client secret, as well as the authorized redirect URI, and we need to paste in that exact same scope so we know which scopes we're going to be using. So let me come here with that authorized redirect URI. I'm going to copy that, and we're going to go back over to the page we were just on for the Google. So right here, you can see we have our authorized redirect URI. Let's just paste that in there right there. This is essentially where we're going to be requesting our information from. In our case, we are on localhost. So we're going to say localhost 3000. If you have a different URL, paste in whatever your current URL is. And that's all you need to do. Click create right here, and that's going to create these credentials for us. And you can see we have our client ID, our secret, which you should try to keep secret. And we can copy both of these over, and we can put these directly into the dashboard for Clerk. So here, use that custom. We have our client ID for this one. And then we want to come over to here with our client secret, copy that over, and that's going to come directly into our dashboard right there. And we want to make sure we have our scope, which it looks like it did not copy over. So I'm going to get that, copy that into here, click add, and now we can click save, and that should save those credentials for us. So now we actually have Google Calendar access for our application when we sign in. And right here, we also want to move these into our application because we're going to use them when we access the Google Calendar API. So inside of our environment variables, we want to have up in this required section, a Google OAuth client ID. That's just going to be this client ID right here. I want to do the exact same thing with our secret. So this is going to be client secret, and paste that in there. And then we're going to have our Google OAuth redirect URL. And that is going to be coming from Clerk. So we can close out of this because now we have all that information we need. We can go all the way back to our dashboard for Clerk, and we can copy that exact same URL that we had right here. This is all the information that we need to be able to sign in and access the Google APIs for the calendar, or literally any other Google APIs that you want. Now also, since we modified our environment variables, we should go into our example version and make sure that we paste these in there. And again, get rid of all of the sensitive information. So we get rid of all of the values and make sure that whoever uses this can add their own values later. Now the next step is going to be accessing the Google Calendar API. So inside of our server folder, let's just create a Google Calendar.ts file. And to access the Google Calendar's API, we need to install the library for it, which is just Google APIs, just like that. Super straightforward. Once that's done installing, we can restart our application. And up here, I just want to make sure I import use server because again, I want to make sure that this is only ever called from our server. Let's get our application restarted, and we can export some functions that we're going to use. For example, get calendar event times. And this will allow me to get all of the different calendar event times that I need, and I'm going to get them for particular information. For example, I want to get them for a Clerk user ID, and I want to get them between a start and an end time, which is just going to be 2 dates, and end, which is going to be a date. There we go. So now we can actually make this function do something. So the very first thing I want to do is I want to get the OAuth client that I can actually use. So we have an OAuth client. And this is how we actually access the Google APIs and know who our authenticated is. So we're going to create a function called get OAuth client. We're going to pass it in our Clerk user ID. So let's create that function, get OAuth client, Clerk user ID, which is a string. So the first thing we need to do is to get the token that Google creates for our user, and that comes from Clerk. So we can say our token is awaiting calling the Clerk client. We want to get the user section, and we want to get a user OAuth access token. Now we want to get it for a particular user ID, so Clerk user ID, and we want to get it specifically for Google, so we can go down until we find Google and select that option. Just make sure this is an asynchronous function. So this is going to give us our token that we get back from the user, and if for some reason our token doesn't exist, so our data.length is equal to 0, or our token.data of 0.token is equal to null, well, then we should return. We essentially don't have what we need to be able to get this information from the user. There we go. But if we do have a correct token, then we can actually create a Google authentication client. So our client is going to be a new google.auth. Whoops. Google, make sure I import that. Import Google from Google APIs. There we go. So now we can get the auth section from it. And actually, when we import this, I should wrap that in brackets. There we go. That should work. So now here, we can say google.auth, and we want to get the OAuth to, and we can pass in all of our different options that we have. So we have first, process.env.google OAuth client ID. And then we need to get the secret. So we can just come down here, get the client secret, and then finally we can paste that down one more time because we need to get the redirect URL. So this is essentially taking all of our credentials and we're saying, okay, here are our credentials. And then what we want to do is we want to set the user credentials. So we're saying, okay, we verified our credentials. Now the credentials for the user are based on the access token, which is just the very first token that we're going to get from our user. There we go. And this should actually say data. There we go. So we're just getting whatever our token is for our user. We're passing that along to our client. And we're also saying, here's all of our information to verify that we are who we say we are. So here's our information. Here's the user's information for the calendar we're going to access. And then we just return that information from here. So this gives us access to a user's information, and it's verified that we are correctly accessing it by all of our own tokens. This information can then be used directly in the Google Calendar API. So we can say Google Calendar. We want to use version 3 of the API. That's just what the current version is. We want to get a list of all the events for a particular user. And here in this auth section is where we pass in our OAuth client. This is how you verify which user you want to access. You also need to pass in the ID of their calendar, and primary is just going to give you their main calendar associated with their email. We can then specify what event types we want. In our case, we only want default events. This is going to be like events that you create. We don't really care about things like holidays, reminders, and tasks. We just want to get whatever the normal events are on the calendar. Also, by passing single events true, this means that anytime you have a reoccurring event, like something that happens every Monday, instead of returning just one instance, it's going to return every single instance in our range of dates. This makes it easier for us to write our code. Then we need to specify the minimum time. So this is just our start.to ISO string. They expect this to be in the ISO string format. Same thing with our maximum time. This is just our end converted to the format that Google is actually expecting. There we go. And then finally, we can specify the max results. This goes up to 2,500. So we're just going to set this to 2,500 to get us all the possible events in the range that we are currently going on. And for the most part, we're going to be using a relatively narrow date range. So it should be almost impossible for someone to have more than 2,500 events. And if they do, their calendar is probably completely full. So they have absolutely no way of adding new events to it. So this is going to give us all of our data, which are our events. We're going to await that information, and we can actually take a look at what that is. So to do that, I'm going to come down here. I'm going to return our events.data.items. This is going to give us all the information returned for us, and it could be null. So we'll just make sure we come in here and expect that it could be null. And if it is null, we just want to return an empty array. So if for some reason there's no data returned, just give us an empty array. Otherwise, we're going to take each one of our different events. And here we have a bunch of information on our event. For example, we have a start section, and this gives us either a date or a date time. If we have a date time, that's going to be a specific date and time of an event. So for example, 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. But if we have a date, that means that this is an all-day event that occurs the entire day. So the very first thing I want to do is I want to check to see if our event.start has a date, just like that. So if our event start has a date that is not equal to null, and our event end has a date that is not equal to null, well, then that means essentially we have a event that occurs the entirety of the day. That means that we no longer want to have anything happen on this day. So essentially I can return a start and end that says that the event is taking up the entire day. So I can return to this. And essentially what I'm trying to return from this function is all of the valid times, or not the valid times, all of the times that my events are occurring. So I want to return that the events are occurring for this entire day. So I can return a start time, which is just going to be my event.start.date, but I want to get the very start of the day. And to do that, we're going to be using datefns. So I can npm I datefns. This is a really handy date library that makes doing lots of date permutations really easy. So here I can say start of day, pass in my date. And what this is going to do, if I just import this function, make sure I pull up here, import start of day from datefns. There we go. What this is going to do is give me the essentially midnight, or not midnight, but yeah, midnight, dawn at the earliest time of the day for that particular day. Then the ending is going to be the end of day event.end.date. So this is essentially going to give me the latest possible time of the day. So this says, okay, for this entire day, the entire day is completely filled with events. Otherwise, if I don't have a date, that means that I need to check to see if I have a time. So if my event.start.date time is not equal to null, and my event.end.date time is not equal to null, well, in this case, I essentially just want to do what I did here, but instead of doing the start of the day and the end of the day, I just want to get a new date for these particular values. So here is my date time that's returned to me. It's going to be a string, and same here. This is going to be a new date. That is going to be my end date time. So we're just converting those to a date. And then finally, what I want to do is if for some reason I get an event that doesn't have a date or a date time, it should be impossible, but it could possibly happen. If that happens, I just want to do a quick filter here where we're just removing all the things that are null. So if there's ever a case where an event doesn't have any of these information associated with it, we're just going to completely ignore it because we don't know how to use that particular event. So now this is going to return to us an array of events that have a start and an end time for when they occur. So we can easily use that information in our application. So now that we've actually hooked up Google Calendar, now we can go back to our application in this public folder and work on actually getting that information and using it. So the very first thing we need to do is get all of our parameters. We have our clerk ID and our event ID that come from our URL. Then we can get our event. So we can just say, this is going to be awaiting, make sure this is an async function. And we can call out to our database. We want to get a query for our event table. We want to find the very first one, where, and we want to call this with a function. There we go. And this is essentially going to take in a bunch of information. So we're first of all going to have our clerk user ID, which we're going to recall our user ID column. Then we need to make sure that is active, and we need to make sure that we have the correct ID. And for here, we're going to have the equal and commands. So here we'll do an and where we do equal is active is true. And then we're going to come in next, do another equal on the user ID column to make sure it's equal to our clerk user ID. And then finally, we're going to do an equal for our ID and event ID. Essentially, this is just making sure all of our different checks are correct. It's active, it's for the correct user, and it's the correct event ID. Then if our event is equal to null, we can just return not found because obviously they entered the URL incorrectly or something along those lines. Now what we can do next is to get our user. So we'll call this the calendar user because this is going to be the user that is actually being the clerk user. So we'll say clerk client. We want to get the users for a particular user ID. There we go. That's going to give us our starting user. The next thing we want to do is determine what the start and end date for all the events we need to check are. So we'll say start date. That's going to be equal to round to nearest minutes. And that's because I want this to be on 15-minute increments. I'm going to start with the current date and time, and I want to round it to the nearest 15 minutes. So we'll say 15 minutes. And then I want to make sure I always round up because obviously we can't select something in the past. So it's going to round up to the nearest 15 minutes. Our end date is just going to be the end of day for 2 months after that point. So add months, 2 months after the current day. So start date, we're going to add 2 to that. So essentially our ending time is just the last day, 2 months in the future. And that's just because you don't want to let people book something on their calendar, a year in advance, because it just doesn't make sense. You don't know when you'll be available. So this gives people a long enough range of time to book things without being too far into the future. Then we can actually get the times that we need. Now here, I'm going to create the variable valid times. These are all of the time slots that are currently valid for the user, and I'm going to do it in 15-minute increments. And this is going to be a function that is going to be called get valid times from schedule. And what this is going to do is it's going to take in a range of all of the different start and end dates that we need. So every single possible time we want to check, we're going to pass into here. So it's going to be an array. And then we're going to pass it in all the information for our event that we want to check for. So here we want to essentially pass it an array of all the dates between our start date and our end date in 15-minute increments. Luckily, dateFNS makes this incredibly easy. We can say each minute out of interval, which by default gives us every single minute between our start and end. So we'll say our start date and our end is our end date. This is going to give us every single minute between these, but we can just pass along a step property, set it to 15, and now it's going to give us every 15-minute increment. So essentially we're passing along an array of every single value every 15 minutes between our start and end date, and then we're passing it to this function along with the event that we want to check for. And the reason I'm doing this is because we're going to probably use this function in multiple locations. So let's go ahead and create this function. We're going to create it in our lib folder. It's just going to be called that exact same thing. Make sure I call this .ts. There we go. Export function, give it that name. And we know that this is going to take in our times in order, and that's a key that they are going to be in order, so we don't have to worry about sorting them. And then the next thing that we're going to get is our event. We really only care about a few things, such as our Clerk user ID and our duration in minutes, which is also going to be a string. So let me make sure that we actually use that as our types. So now what we can do is we can get our start time, which is equal to our times in order at the 0 index. Our end is equal to times in order at the -1 index. That's just going to be the very last one. And if for some reason our start equals null or our end equals null, we're just going to return an empty array because obviously there's no valid times if there's no start or end date to work with. Then we want to get our schedule. We can get that schedule based on our Clerk user ID. So we can say equals await db.query. Make sure that this is an async function that is taking in our database. We want to query the schedule table. We want to find the first one, and we want to find it where, just like this. There we go. So we want to first check our Clerk user ID, which is our user ID column. And then we want to use the equal function from here. So we can say equals user ID column, Clerk user ID. So we're just getting the schedule for the particular user. Make sure that I actually rename that. There we go. And our Clerk user ID here is our event.Clerk user ID since we're passing this in as an event. So that's going to get us all that information. We also want to get the availabilities. So we're going to say availability is true. So we can get all the availabilities for our schedule as well. Then if our schedule equals null, well, that means we don't have any availabilities. So again, we have no valid time slots, returning empty array. The next thing I want to do is I want to group our availabilities. So we're going to say grouped availabilities. This is kind of the same thing we've already done where we just do an object.groupBy. I'm going to group my schedule.availabilities on the day of the week. There we go. So we're just grouping them by the day of the week. And then the very last thing that we need to get is our event times from Google Calendar. So that's just await get calendar event times. We've already created that function, takes in our Clerk ID and a start and an end date, just like that. So now that we have all of the times that we want to check, we have our event, which includes the duration. We also have all of the available time slots, as well as all the time slots that are already filled. we can now combine all of this information together in a somewhat complicated filter to make sure we return only the time slots that are actually open and don't have conflicts with our availabilities or our event times. So what we can do is come down here, we can get all of our times in order. So we're going to filter through all of the time slots we have, and we just want to check, is this time slot available or not? If it's not available, don't return it. So this is going to give us an interval date because it just has a start and an end time. So first of all, I want to get all of my availabilities that are for this particular time. So I'm going to turn that into a function just because it's a rather large bit of code. So availabilities, there we go, get availabilities. That's going to take in my grouped availabilities. It's also going to take in my interval date, and it's going to take in my schedule time zone because we need to make sure, again, we're accounting for all the different time zone possibilities. So here, let's just create that function, get availabilities. And here I'll just paste in what all of our different things we're expecting. Our grouped availabilities is just going to be essentially a partial object that contains a day of week as the key, and then it's going to contain are essentially everything from our schedule availability table in an array. So that's essentially what this is saying. It's just mapping what our grouped availabilities is as an actual type. Then it's taking in a date and it's taking in a time zone. That's what this interval date is. It's just a date for us. Now what I want to do inside of here is essentially I want to get all of my different availabilities and map them to an interval essentially. So here I'm going to create a variable called availabilities. This is either going to be undefined or it's going to be an array of schedule availabilities. Then instead of typing this out, I'm just going to paste this down because this is a massive list of code. Essentially, I'm going to be checking each time, what day of the week are we? Are we on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, so on? And if for each day, just get the availabilities for that particular day. So here you can see, I'm just checking each individual day and getting the availabilities for that actual day. So we're just going to come through here, import these functions. There we go. So for each day, whichever one we currently are on, those are going to be our availabilities. And then if for some reason there are no availabilities, so for example, it's equal to null because we don't have any time slots that day or something, return an empty array because there's no time slots that work on that day. Otherwise, we're going to take all of our availabilities and we're going to convert them from their string version to an actual date in the correct time zone. So let's map through each one of them. Each one is going to have a start time and an end time, just like that. And here, our start is just going to be equal. And what we're setting it equal to is essentially taking our start time, which is a string, and converting it to a date and then to the correct time zone. So to deal with time zones, we actually need to import a library called datefnstz. That's going to be for all the different time zone utilities we're going to have. And then that's going to give us a function called fromZonedTime. Let me make sure that I import this all the way at the top here. Import fromZonedTime from date, whoops. There we go, datefnstz. So now if we scroll all the way back down here, this allows us to convert essentially from one time zone to the actual time zone that we care about. So we can pass in here the actual date that we have. If we scroll all the way up, that's the date that we're passing in. So this is going to be a date that we're converting to the time zone, but we want to convert the date for our particular start time. So this date gives us the actual day that we're on. And what I want to do is I want to set the hours and the minutes to my start time hours and minutes. So I can say set hours. I can pass it in my date, and I can pass it in my start time dot split on the colon, and I want to get the very first value from here because that's my number of hours. Close that off. Make sure I import set hours. There we go. And I also want to make sure I parse this as an integer. There we go. So now if I give that a quick save, essentially right now how this has started out is I've taken a date and I've set the hours of that date to whatever my start time hours are. I essentially want to do the exact same thing for minutes. So I'm going to set the minutes, paste this down, and for the second parameter here, I essentially just want to get the minutes, which are going to be at index 1. There we go. Make sure I import this function, set minutes, and I think I need to make sure this is properly imported. And of course, I also need to pass in the time zone. So the last thing I need to pass in is my time zone, just like that. And this time zone, again, is coming from all the way up here. I pass that directly in right here based on my schedule. So whatever time zone my schedule is in, I'm going to be saying whatever day we're currently on, set the hours and the time, and convert it to whatever time zone I'm expecting it to be in. I can then do the exact same thing for my end. So instead of start, this will say end, and instead of start time, this will say end time. So convert my start and my end, and then finally down here, return the start and the end dates. So we actually have an interval between a start and end. So just like we did all the way up here with our calendar events, we converted them to a start and an end. I'm doing the exact same thing here with each availability for that particular day, convert it to a start and an end time. The final piece of the puzzle is taking my event, and I just need to essentially say, how long is my event? So I can come into here, I can get an event interval, and this is going to be a start time, which is at whatever date I'm currently trying to schedule this at, which is my interval date. And then I know that my event has a certain duration, so the end time is just adding minutes to this equal to my duration. So this is my interval date combined with my event.duration in minutes. There we go. And for some reason, I typed this incorrectly. This event duration in minutes should be a number. There we go. So now what I essentially have is all of my times in order. And for each of those times, I'm checking, can I schedule this time? So first what I do is I check to see all of my availabilities related to that particular day. And then I say, okay, if I were to choose this time, my event is going to take up this amount of time. So given how long my event's going to take up, what available time slots I have, and what events I already have booked on my calendar, what can I actually fit into my schedule? So this is where we can take all of this information that we've gleaned and we can actually turn it into a final thing that's going to return to us what we need. So first of all, I can take all my event times and I can check to see if every single event time fits a certain criteria. Because again, I want this to return true for me to actually keep this event in my thing. So here I want to make sure that all of these are not overlapping. So I can have my event time just like that. And I want to check for each and every one of these, I want to return that they are not overlapping. So they have this nice function, are intervals overlapping? That's from date F and S. And I can just pass in my two intervals. So my event time and my event interval. And essentially what this is doing is saying, okay, for each one of my current calendar events, are any of them overlapping with the time that this event would occur if I schedule it at this exact minute? If I'm overlapping with any of them, this is going to return false. But of course, I need to also check to make sure it fits within one of these availabilities as well. So I need to add another statement into here. So first, I'm checking to make sure it fits within my calendar events. Then I'm going to check all of my availabilities and see as long as it fits within one of my availability slots, it's okay. That's why I'm using some, because as long as one of these is true, that is okay. So for each availability, what I want to do is I want to return to see if this entire event was within another interval. So what I can do, event interval dot start and availability. Whoops, availability. There we go. And I want to check to see if it's also within the end time. So put in the end just like that, give that a quick save. And what this code is doing is it's just checking, okay, I have my availability. So for each availability, I loop through it, has a start and an end time. And I'm checking, okay, is the start of my event within this availability? Okay, good. Also, is the end of my event within this availability? So is both the start and end time of my event within this slot that I have available on my schedule based on whatever I specified in my schedule? If that's true, then that means that we have an availability that's open for this particular thing. So not only do I need to have at least one availability open, I also need to have no calendar events that overlap with that slot. If all of that information comes back correct, then I'm going to say, you know what, return true. This particular time that I'm looping through is okay. So this time interval date is going to come back true. So this is just going to return to me the times that do not overlap with my calendar events and are within the available scheduled slots that I have. So now what I can do is I can go back to this page, we can import this function, and we should see that we have no errors, which is great. And now we're just getting an array of dates, which are the valid dates that we can actually do something with. If for some reason we don't have any valid times at all, well, then we just need to let the user know. So we can come in here. If our valid times is equal to that, we can just render out a component we're going to call no time slots. And we're going to need to pass in information about our event and our calendar user so we can let the user know. So we'll say calendar user, just like that. And then we'll create this component. So we can come down here. I'm just going to paste in the component. I'll show you what it does. But essentially, all we're doing is we're just rendering out a simple card to the user that is telling them, hey, you're trying to book an event with this particular user. And then we're also listing out what the event description is. And then inside the content, instead of showing a form, we're just saying, hey, you know what, this person's currently completely booked up, so try again later. And we're essentially saying, you know, you can go back to the original page that you're on to check. Maybe you can choose an event that is shorter or something. So choose a shorter event. Here's a link to get back to that particular location. So now if that valid time length is equal to 0, it's going to run that out to us. If we give this a quick refresh, we're still getting high, but if I change this to be not equal to 0, and then I give this a quick refresh, we should see that time slot show up. Let's just make sure we have everything showing. You can see we get that loading screen because this takes a while. And of course, we're getting an error with our Google Calendar related information. I believe there's a couple of reasons why this could be happening. The first is because we haven't actually given this user permission to access Google Calendar because we've never signed in with our new permissions enabled. So first of all, what I'm going to do is we're going to remove everything that we have here just to go to our home page. And I'm going to sign out of our user and sign back in, so hopefully it'll ask us to authenticate our Google Calendar. So let's select our user. Access is blocked because it's not completed the Google verification process. To fix this problem, remember how I mentioned you may need to add a test user? Well, this is exactly what it's talking about. So back into here, we need to go to our OAuth consent screen, which is inside of here, OAuth consent screen. We want to make sure that we add a test user, paste in the email for our user, click save, and that's going to add this particular user for us. Now we should hopefully be able to authenticate with that user. So let's go back to our application. We'll need to go back and redo our sign-in process. Click on this. See, Google has not verified this app. That's okay. We just haven't gone through a verification step. It's a rather lengthy thing. We can sign into this, click continue, and now you can see it wants to view all of our calendar data. We're going to click that. That's okay. Click continue, and that's at least one step of the way there. So let's copy this link, and we're just going to paste that in. Go to that particular link. It's going to load that page, and now you can see Google API has not been enabled for this project. So we can enable it by visiting the URL that it gives us. So we're just going to go directly to that URL. Click on that, and this will allow us to actually enable access to the Google Calendar API. Click enable, and boom, that's all you need to do. This should just take a second, and once that's done, we now have the ability to access the Google Calendar API. There we go. Now let's go back into our local host, refresh this page, and see if that actually works. Looks like it's still not quite working. There we go, it just finished working, and you can see, book this with Kyle. Kyle is currently booked up. Please check back later. And that's because I set this to not equal to 0. If I set it equal to 0, now you can see that I do have valid times, so it's just going to render out the text hi. Now, obviously, instead of rendering out the text hi, I'm going to render out essentially a card, and this card is going to be just a title like this, description of the event that's going on, very similar to what we did down here. The only difference is now we're going to render out this form. For now, I'm just going to comment it out so you can see what this looks like. You can see book and whatever the event name is with Kyle Cook, and then obviously bring in the form that we're going to be creating in just a second so we can close down all of this. Luckily, at this point, we've done 99% of the complicated work. All we have left to do is add in a form, which is something we've already done before, so it's not too hard. So I'm just going to copy our event form, might as well. Meeting form, there we go. And all the way up here, we'll call this meeting form. So the very first thing we want to do for our meeting form is to set up a meeting form schema. So we can just, every time we have an event form, replace that with our meeting form schema. And where we're importing that, we can change that to meetings, and we can actually create a file for that. So inside of our schemas, let's create a brand new one for meetings.ts. And we're going to export a constant called meeting form schema. And that's going to be a Zod object. So z.object. And in here, we want to specify the start time. So this is going to be z.date. Then we want to specify a guest email, which is z.string.email. So we know that it's actually going to be a valid email. And we want to make sure this is actually there. So we'll put a minimum of 1 on this, and we'll say required. Then what we're going to do is we're going to have a guest name, z.string, again, minimum of 1, since it should be required. And then we need the guest notes. This is not required, so we can just say z.string.optional. Then lastly, we need to actually specify a time zone, which is just a string again. And again, this one is not optional, so we're going to make sure it's required. Now, technically, the last thing that we need is going to be a date because we're both selecting a date and a time on our form. So this is going to be a z.date. We're going to make sure that the minimum of this is the start of the day for the new date. There we go. And they don't select something that's within that minimum. We can just say must be in the future. There we go. We can also specify a minimum for our start date as well, which is just new date, because we just don't want it to be anything earlier than the current time. Obviously, that doesn't make sense. So now that we have our schema done, we can go over and start working on this. This is meetings. There we go. Meeting form schema. Make sure I spell that correctly and make sure I actually exported it from here. Meeting form schema. Meeting form schema. I'll just try manually importing it. That should hopefully fix whatever error I was getting. There we go. So now we get our schema. We can get rid of this is delete. Our default values, really we only have one default value we want to pass in, and that is the time zone. Everything else we want the user to select themselves. So we can say intl.datetime format we want to get the resolved options for our time zone. That'll just give us the user's current time zone, just like that. Now, the next thing I want to work on is the data we're passing in. We're going to be passing in our valid times. That's that array of all of our data, our event ID, and our clerk user ID. So down here, valid times is a date array. Our event ID is a string, and our clerk user ID is a string as well. So that's just all the information we're passing into here, which is exactly what we want. Now for our on submit, we can kind of just clean this up a little bit. Obviously, this is just going to be our create meeting. It's going to pass in our values. For now, we're not going to worry about this because we're not quite at that point. So we'll just minimize that down because we really need to work on creating our form itself. So the very first field we need is our time zone field, and that can come directly from our schedule form because essentially we've already done this before. So let me scroll up to where we have our time zone field, which I believe is right here. Yep. I'm just going to copy this entire thing because it pretty much should be a drop-in replacement exactly the same. Give that a quick save. And it looks like we obviously need to import our select component. But after we do that, we should have everything we need inside of here. So we'll get that imported. There we go. And of course, formatting our thing. There we go. And it looks like that is all we need to do to get that time zone section imported. Give that a quick save. Obviously, I don't think anything's going to render over here quite properly because we have a bunch of errors for everything else, but at least we have this showing up. To actually see what this looks like, though, we can actually render out this meeting form. So let's go back into our page that we're trying to render this out at, and let's make sure we just import our meeting form. That cleans up the errors here. We're probably going to get some more errors trying to render this out. Give it a quick refresh. I'm sure it'll error out as it is. So in our meeting form, we can kind of get rid of a lot of stuff. We don't need these form fields. We don't need this form field. We obviously don't need these form fields. We do want to have this section down here, but obviously no deleting. We will want the cancel button, but we don't have to worry about the delete pending status. So we give that a quick save. That hopefully should clean up a lot of our errors. And now, as you can see, we do have our time zone selector, which is great. Next thing we can move on to is our date selector. So if we look at the documentation for ShadCN for a date picker, it actually uses multiple components. It uses the calendar component as well as the popover component. So we need to make sure we import both of those from ShadCN. So we're going to come in here with a ShadCN, and I want to get the calendar and the popover, just like that. Give that a quick run, and hopefully that should install all of our dependencies. Looks like our button is already there. Yeah, of course, we don't want to overwrite that. There we go. So that is great. Now we have our calendar and our popover, so we can use that. And we can essentially copy the code directly from here for doing our calendar. But instead, I'm just going to copy the code from the final working example of this. So let me just minimize this down, copy it over for you, and I'll explain exactly what the code's doing. It's just a lot for me to type out by hand and really doesn't bring you a lot of value. So right after our time zone here, we can paste in the entire section for our start time and everything like that. So first of all, start time section, we can get rid of that. But we have our date section all the way up here. You can see it's a lot of code that's being rendered out. So first of all, let's import all the things we're using, such as the popover. We also have the popover trigger that we need to make sure we import. We have a calendar icon that we need to import. And of course, this section and the calendar itself, which again is coming in there. And then we just have a few extra functions and things that we haven't used before. So this is same day, we can actually import. Make sure I click the right keys to import that. There we go. And now you can see we have this format date function that we need to make sure that we're using. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to create that format date function. That's going to be inside of our formatters. This is a super basic function. I'll just paste it in. Essentially, we create a datetime formatter with the style of medium and format any date that we use for that. So now we can import that. There we go. That's coming in perfectly fine. And the last thing we don't have is this valid times in time zone. I'll get to that in just a little bit, but I do want to show you what all the styling for this looks like. So essentially we have a form field. We gave it the name of date, pretty straightforward. And then we have this popover. So the first thing we have is our form item with the label. And then our popover trigger is just going to be this button. So we have a button that is our form control, which has a calendar icon, and it also shows us the date of the currently selected date. Otherwise it says pick a date. And these styles are just to make sure that it all looks relatively nice. The next step is going to be the content that shows up in the popover. This is like a modal that shows up right next to our content. And this is just going to be a calendar that allows us to actually select a single element from it. And whenever we select something, we set it to our value. And here again, when we select something, we set it to our value. And here we set our selected value as whatever our current value is. Now we also want to disable all of the times that don't have any valid times in that particular time zone. So right now, if we scroll to the top, we have all of our valid times, but we haven't converted them to whatever the current time zone is. So we should probably do that next. So to do that, we can come down here. We can say that our time zone is equal to form.watch and we want to watch the time zone. This is going to give us an updated version of our time zone every single time that we change it. Then we can get our valid times in time zone. And this I'm actually going to use a use memo for, just because this might be a slightly slow thing to compute. So we'll say use memo, just like that. And we want to update this every time our valid times changes or every time our time zone changes. So now what we can do is we can just say we're going to be returning from this our valid times. We want to map them. We want to take each of our different dates and we want to convert it to that zoned time using that datefns library. And we want to pass in whatever time zone we want to convert to. So we're just converting from our current date to the particular time zone that we want to use. So that's going to give us our valid times in the time zone. And down here, all we're doing is we're checking, do we have any times in this time zone for this particular day? If this does not have any times at all for the current date, obviously it's going to be a disabled date that doesn't show up. So now if we restart our application, there we go. We should hopefully see we now have a date selector over on the right-hand side of our screen. We'll just give it a quick refresh to see that show up on our screen. Give it a quick second. It's just starting up our whole application. That's why it's taking a little bit of time to run everything. But we should see that in just a second. There we go. It's loading our thing. And now we have the pick a date. And as you can see, all the dates that I didn't give availability to, for example, Tuesdays, Thursdays, Saturdays, are completely blocked out. And Wednesdays also blocked out because I have things already on my calendar for that day. So it doesn't let me choose it. But I can choose like the 11th, for example, and it's going to let me do that day and so on. And you can see it goes 2 months out, and then everything in the future is just going to be grayed out because there's nothing on those days and nothing in the past is selectable either. Now, the next thing I want to do, now that we have this form field for our actual date, is I want to add a selector for our time. And this one is going to be a bit interesting. So we're going to just copy everything we have in here, paste it down. It's not going to be very similar to this, but at least we get our form field done. This one is going to be for our start time, just like that. It's going to take in a field. And for this one, for my form item, I want this to say time. Obviously, we're not going to be dealing with a popover trigger or a popover, so I can get rid of all the popover related stuff. We're just going to remove that and that. And of course, we don't have a calendar, so I'm going to remove that as well. So now instead of our form control, we're going to be using a select because I just want to be able to select all the different possible times that I can use. So coming here with that. First of all, I want this to be disabled if my date is equal to null or my time zone is equal to null. And to get our date, since we don't actually have that, we can come up here where we watched for our time zone. We can do the exact same thing for our date. So now we're going to get anytime our date or time zone change, it updates. So it'll make sure it re-enables this when it's possible. Then on value change, we want to set this equal to our field.onChange, and we want to get a new date from this. So new date is date.parse of our value. And this is going to be taking in a particular value. So this is just value, just like that. And that's because this select field, this value is always going to be a string. And we want to convert that into an actual date. So we're parsing this value using date.parse to give us a number that we can convert this to, and then we're setting that to a new date. So this is just converting it from a string to an actual date. Now the way that we're setting our value is we're just going to be taking our default value here, and we're going to be setting it equal to field.value, and we're going to be converting that to an ISO string. So we're just converting to an ISO string and converting from an ISO string every time we change our value and set our value. So each of our select values are going to have a string-based value, but when we store that inside of our form object, it's going to be converted to a date. Then we can come inside of our select, and this is where our form control is going to go. So take our form control, paste it in there, get rid of this entire button, and move our form control into the select. And this is where we're going to have our select trigger. So select trigger just like that. And this is going to show our select value. And we want to make sure that we format this properly. So we're going to give it a placeholder value. And the placeholder is going to depend on if our date is null or our time zone is equal to null. If that's the case, then we want to tell them to select a date first. So select a date/time zone first. Otherwise, select a meeting time. There we go. So that you can see on the side, we have our placeholder text. Right now it says select A, but we'll see what it says more so when we get to the rest of our things. We first need to figure out what our select container content is going to be. So we'll have our select content next. This is where essentially our array of options are. So we're going to loop through all of the valid times in our time zone, and we want to filter only the ones for the current day. So is same day, time, and the current date that we have selected. So only the ones for our current date are what we're going to use. And then we're going to map through each one of our times, and we're going to create a select item. The select item obviously needs a key since we are in an array. So the key is just going to be my time converted to an ISO string. And then our value is going to be the same exact thing. So value is time.to ISO string. There we go. Make sure I close off our select item. And actually, instead of fully closing it off, we want to put the value inside of there. So select item, there we go. And inside of our select item, we want to format our time string and pass it in our time. And this is a function that we need to create. So going over to our formatters, we can paste this down. Our format time string, just like our date, we're just getting the short version of our time string. And then I also have a format date time, which is just essentially using the date time medium and the time of short. This is going to be used a little bit later, so I figured I might as well throw it in there. Super straightforward stuff though. So back into our meeting form, we can add that in there, give this a quick save, and that hopefully gives us those options. So now let's go ahead and scroll up and make sure that these stack vertically on a smaller screen. So we can say like medium flex column, and maybe actually what we should be doing is doing flex column by default, and medium is going to be flex row. There we go. So there we go. By default on these smaller screen sizes, they're going to be stacked side by side, and on larger, they're going to be stacked next to each other. That looks pretty good. And as you can see, when we shrink that down, you can see select a date/time zone first. As soon as I select a date, for example, this Friday, now I can select all the meeting times and it shows me only the times available that I have. So you can see it's pretty much all of the times because my calendar is completely empty. If I went to a date like Wednesday, I can't even click on because it's full, but pretty much my calendar is going to show all the times because there's nothing currently in my calendar. So now what we can do is we can minimize this entire div down. I'm just going to paste down the next div. This is for the name field and the email field. These are both things we've done a million times. Essentially all I'm doing is just creating a field with the correct name and hooking up the input field. I want to make sure that these ones also stack on smaller screen sizes, but that should be all we need to do to actually add in the name and the email field. Super straightforward. And while I'm at it, I'm just going to copy over the actual text area as well. Again, we've done this a million times. These are your guest notes. Here's the section for the notes at the very bottom. And if I increase my screen size, you can see now things are stacked side by side, or they can be stacked vertically on a smaller screen. Now for our cancel button here, this obviously needs to go to a different location. This is going to go to /book/ and it's going to go to whatever the user ID is. So Clerk user ID, just like that. And then we have our submit button as well. And this should probably say something like schedule. There we go. So now if I come down here and click cancel, it should bring me back to this page. And if I choose a shorter time, for example, this 30-minute meeting, if I click select on that, and I go over here, you can now see I can select Wednesday the 4th because I have slots that I can fit in a short meeting for that particular time, quite a few actually. While if I go back and I choose this very long one, 3 hours and 54 minutes, you can see that I have no time on Wednesday to fit that. So we at least know that this is working as we expect it to. It's making sure it conforms with my calendar. Now the final step is just to make it so that our actual form submits itself and works properly. Now for creating our meeting, we're actually going to pass in more than just the values from our form. So we're going to take in all of our form values, but we also need to pass in the event ID and the Clerk user ID. These are all the information that we need for this create meeting function. And then we can go ahead and actually create this function. So all the way down here at the bottom in our server and our actions, we're going to create a brand new one for meetings, and we're going to export a function for creating a meeting just like that. Use server and import use server so we know it doesn't get imported anywhere else. Now we can kind of start similar to our events where we needed to just get our data and make sure it was successful. So I'm just going to copy this over, make this a little bit wider so we can really work with it. Go over to our meetings, not the schema. There we go, the action. I'm just going to paste that in there. We're going to have our unsafe data, which is going to be coming in. That is going to be a particular type. Right now, we'll just type it as any. We're going to have our Clerk user ID. And the reason I'm putting this as any right now is because if we look at our schema right now has all of this information. But honestly, inside of our action, we need slightly different information. We don't need the date. We don't care about that. But we do need all this other information. Plus, we need the event ID and the Clerk ID. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to break this schema into a separate object called meeting schema base. There we go. And that's going to be equal to pretty much this entire thing. So we'll just paste that down. But of course, the date is not something I need on the server. So we're going to remove that. Now my meeting form schema, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an object that has just the date because that's the only thing I care about. Plus I want to merge in all the base. So we're going to merge in the base schema into there. So this is just going to add a date to this base. Now for our action, we're going to export a meeting action schema because it's going to be slightly different. It's an object. And for this one, I want the event ID, which is z.string. And again, I want to make sure this is required, so we'll put in a minimum of 1. I want to do the exact same thing with the Clerk user ID. So it's going to have all that information, plus it's going to merge in everything from the base. So the start time, time zone, and so on. So this is going to make sure that I get different information depending on where I'm actually at. So now I can use this meeting action schema in my action to type this information. So z.infer, the type of this particular schema. There we go. Now I'm getting that in, and I can use that schema to get my data right there. And I actually don't even need to authenticate the user because, again, this is something that's public. Anyone should be able to access this page. Now, after I verify that my data is correct by doing this, the next thing I need to do is get my event. So I'm just going to paste this code in because we've written this code like 6 times at this point. All we need to do, query our table for the Clerk user ID, the isActive, and the ID, and make sure that isActive is true. The Clerk ID comes from our data, and the ID for the event comes from our data. All of those should be matching. And if we don't have an event, then of course return that there is an error because something bad went wrong. Now we want to get all the valid times that we can use because, again, we want to revalidate that this is a correct time for the user's calendar. So get valid times from the schedule is just going to be a single date. We just want to check this particular start time. That's why I'm passing it just a single item in the array. And then I want to pass the event. So I want to check, is this particular date valid for this particular event? And this should return to us a valid time. If valid times dot length is equal to 0, well, that means we have some type of error again because we have no valid time, so they passed us a time that's not correct. Now, if all of this passes though, then what I want to do is I actually want to create a calendar event, which is a function that we can create in just a second. And I want to pass it in all of the data for what we're going to be passing in, the duration in minutes, which is just our event dot duration in minutes. And then finally the event name, which is our event dot name. Make sure I spell all this correctly. There we go. And now we can create this function, which is going to be in our Google Calendar. So let's call them all the way up here. Export async function, just like that. Now we're going to be getting a lot of props in. We're going to get that Clerk user ID and event name, and we're going to get that duration, but we're also getting the guest name, guest email, start time, and guest notes all from that data we passed up. And I'm just typing all that information, essentially just saving you from watching me type that out multiple times. Now the first thing we need to do is get that OAuth client. So we can come in here, get that OAuth client, and we can also get the calendar user. So what I can do inside of here, const calendar user is awaiting Clerk client dot users dot get user, and we want to get that Clerk user ID. So we're just going to get the Clerk user so we can actually get their name and email and so on. And then I want to make sure that they have a primary email address. They should, but just in case, I want to double check. So if the primary email address is equal to null, then I want to throw an error. This should almost never happen. Clerk user has no email. There we go. This really is not something that you should ever run into. Then I can create a calendar event by calling that Google API. So the calendar API for version 3. I want to get the events, and I want to insert a brand new event, and I want to insert it with all this information. So the calendar ID is the primary calendar. Our auth is our OAuth client. I want to specify send updates to be all. This is going to make sure it emails people when they actually get added to this event. So it's going to send an email to them that they can accept to be added to this event. And then we have the request body, which contains pretty much everything else. For example, who are all the people attending this meeting? Well, the very first person we have is the person sending the email. So we have the guest email, and the display name for that user is the guest's name. That's relatively straightforward. The next person is just the person you're adding the event to the calendar for. So that's our calendar user dot primary email address dot email address. Their display name is just going to be the calendar user dot full name. And then finally, we want to make sure that their response status is set to accepted. So we can just say here, accepted. There we go. And that's just going to make sure that they by default already accept this meeting because it makes it easier for them. Next, after our attendees, we want to add a description. And this description is going to be either our guest notes. So if we have guest notes, it's going to say additional details followed by our guest notes. Otherwise, it's just going to be undefined because we don't have any additional details we want to pass in. There we go. Then after this, we need to make sure we have our start time for our event, which is a date time in our case, which is a new date for our start time. And actually, we don't need to convert this to a new date because it already is a date. So we can just say start time.to ISO string. That'll convert it to the format Google Calendar expects. And then we need the end time. And the end time is just going to be adding minutes to our start time. So we can say start time. We're adding some minutes. In our case, it's the duration. In minutes is how long we're adding. And then we're converting that to an ISO string, just like that. Make sure we import this add minutes function. And of course, we need to make sure we say that this is the date time that we're setting, just like this. That'll let us import this function. And then the very last thing we need to do is just add in the summary, and that's just the title of the event. So this is going to be guest name plus whatever our calendar user full name is, and then finally our event name, just like that. So this is how we create a brand new calendar event, and we can return that to the user in case they want to see it. So we can return our calendar event.data. So now we can go back into where we were defining that action. We can import this function that we just created. So now we can create a calendar event. And finally, if all of that goes by successfully, well, then we can just redirect them to a success page. So we can say book / and we want to add in the data clerk user ID. We also want to add in the data.event ID. And then finally, we can add in the success, since we're going to a success page. And we can say what the start time for the event is, so we can show that on the success page. So we'll say data.starttime.toISOstring, just so we can convert this to a format that's easier to work with. Now make sure that we import the correct redirect. Looks like I got the wrong one imported again. So we'll come down here, import the correct one, there we go, and that's going to work. So now let's go to our meeting form, and let's try to create this meeting, just like that. That looks like that imported correctly. Looks like everything else in here was imported correctly. We can get rid of some of this stuff that we don't actually need. There we go. And now let's see if this works. Let's go over here. And of course, we're getting an error immediately. Let me just refresh our page to make sure. There we go. Just some caching stuff. We will do this event right here. We'll select right here. It's loading our page. Make this a little bigger so it's easy to see. We will pick this on Wednesday the 4th. We will do a meeting time of 1:15. My name will be Kyle. My email will be test@test.com. And then finally, let's actually make it example.com. There we go. And then some notes, just so we can test all of this stuff. Let's click schedule to see if that works. Looks like it's loading, and it looks like it did work because it redirected us to that new page. Let's check our calendar to see if we have that new event added. And you can see right here, this is from when I was testing at the beginning, but you can see right here, Kyle plus Kyle Cook, because I gave my name Kyle. Here's the event I scheduled. It's for a half hour at exactly 1:15, which is when I scheduled that event for. We can also test to make sure that this works with time zones as well. So let's just go back real quick here. And let's come in here and let's say that I want to do a time zone of -3, for example. And we're going to do this Friday, and we're going to select Friday at 11 a.m. This should be 9 a.m. my time zone. It doesn't really matter what we put in for all of this information. There we go. We'll click schedule. So we should see on September 6th at 9 a.m. my time zone, there should have been an event created. And there we go. At 11 o'clock a.m., there was an event scheduled. So it looks like maybe the time zone stuff is not quite working as we expect. I believe this is because when we get the information into our action, we're never actually converting it to the correct time zone. So here we're getting our time zone information, but we're not actually using that information to set our time. So what I want to do for our get valid times from schedule, we want to make sure we get this in the correct time zone. So I'm going to say const time, or we'll say start in time zone is going to be equal to our data.startTime, and we want to call from zoned time and pass in the data.timezone. There we go. And what this is going to do is it's going to convert from this time zone to our actual local time zone, the time zone that makes the most sense for us. Then what I can do is everywhere that I would normally use data.startTime, I'm just going to replace that with the correct time, except for down here, I will pass them down their local time zone because that's what they selected. But then when I create my particular event, I want my start time to be my start in zone time, and I believe that should overwrite the time that's on here. That should hopefully fix any problems that we were having. So let me just see if that works. We'll come back over here, make this a little bit bigger so it's really easy to see. I will delete this event so we can try it with a brand new one. Then we're going to come over here to our page, go back so that we can rebook this particular event, refresh to make sure there's no weird caching stuff. We'll pick Friday at, and we want to make sure we do it with a different time zone. So 11 a.m. should be 9 a.m. Some random bogus information. Click schedule. And hopefully this time it actually shows up at 9 a.m. on the calendar. So here, calendar, and now you can see it is at 9 a.m. So we were just not quite formatting our time zone correctly, but now we are. So the last thing we have left to do is just to make this a success page. So all the way up here, inside of our particular event, let's create a brand new folder called success. And inside of here, we need a page.tsx, export default function success page. And before we get to this page, I first of all want to make sure that we are making none of these pages static, so we can export the const revalidate equals 0. I want to do that on all my dynamic pages. So on this page and on this page here, I'm going to do the exact same thing. Now on this success page, we can just return null, and it should give us a completely blank page, as it does. So now we can go ahead and actually make sure it's filled with content. First of all, we have a bunch of params we should be taking in. I'm just going to copy these over because it's a lot to type out. So we'll just paste in those params real quick. So we have our params, which is our clerk ID and our event ID, and then we have that one search param, which is our start time. So we can get our event, which is just await. So make sure this is an async function. We want to get this from our database. We want to query. And again, I think I'll just copy this over because we've seen this a million times actually. So let's just paste this in. There we go. All I'm doing is I'm just getting the event based on the particular user ID if it's active and the event ID. If it doesn't exist, obviously we get a not found. Then we're going to get the calendar user and we're going to convert our start time to an actual date. So here we go. We have our clerk client that we're getting the particular user. And again, we're converting that start time to an actual date. Then we can return some real information down here in the form of a card. Again, this card format is pretty much something we've used multiple times, so I'm just going to copy this in and explain exactly what's going on for this section. So let me just make sure we get these last few imports going. There we go, and this format date time function is that function that we created earlier. So now if I give this a save, we should get it rendered. See, successfully booked this event with this particular person at 11 a.m., which is my local time for the user. Well, it's not showing the actual time on the person's calendar, it's showing it in the time zone they selected, which is what we want. So as you can see here, what we've essentially done is we've just got the event for the particular thing, for the particular user, we got the user's name, and then we're just rendering out a simple success message in a pretty much a basic card that has a simple max size set to it. I also, again, want to make sure that this page is not static. So again, we're going to set that revalidate so we don't get some weird stuff showing up. Now, the very last thing that we need to do that we haven't actually done yet is we need to make sure that all the way down here in our middleware that we set this as a public route. So we can come in here /book, and we can do that .star circle. There we go. And that way, if you're signed out, you can actually book something because you shouldn't have to be signed in to book something with a particular user. So to make sure that this works, we can come to this page and we can actually sign out. And then we can go back to this page, click the back button a couple of times to get back to this selector. And if we refresh, you can see we can still access this page. While if I get rid of this, it's actually going to redirect me to the sign-in page when I refresh here, as you can see. So obviously we don't want this. We want those to be public pages, which is why I made sure that they were public. So now it looks like everything's working and these are completely public pages. Now, if you enjoyed this video, I highly recommend you check out my other big project-based videos. I'll link them right over here. And I also recommend you checking out Clerk and Neon, the sponsors for this video, because their products are amazing and I absolutely love them, and I'm sure that you'll love them too. With that said, thank you very much for watching and have a good day.